Sego aguego, skunat goa, Kirsten enka yunjats, chochage kidero, de etino warado, neoquasonha, de etino warado, neyetiston a, tioatiade, nyawa. So welcome to our event today. My name is Kirsten Anker. I'm an associate professor here at the Faculty of Law at McGill. I'm coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And there is a protocol for university meetings, one might say a law for meetings, that we begin by acknowledging Indigenous territories. And here in Montreal, we are on Mohawk land, also a meeting site for other nations such as the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and others. There's another protocol, maybe even a law of hospitality, which says that we should speak the language of our hosts. So by opening with my very childish Mohawk, I am identifying Ganyekgeha, or Mohawk, as the language of the land, and this land as the land of the Ganyekgeha. In my opening, I said hello, I introduced myself, and I also included a few brief lines of the Ahonda Gariwadekwa, which is a different kind of territorial acknowledgement. It's a greeting to the land and a thanksgiving for all that it gives us. It usually takes a lot longer than that, so I just included a few lines. And it itself is a kind of law for Haudenosaunee peoples. It's both a regular practice or protocol and something that reminds people of a foundational aspect of their legal order, namely their interdependence with all things in creation and their gratitude for those gifts. So I just want to end my opening with a few words of my own gratitude for my Mohawk language instructor, Agwira Deka Martin, for elders Otsitsagonra, John Cree, and Freddie and Annie Deer, who have taught me about the Ahonda Gariwadekwa. Now I'm going to pass over to my co-organizer for the event today, Mark Antaki.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci, Kirsten. Thank you. This is the 15th Institute of Jurilinguistics. I'm the director of the Paul-André Crépeau Centre for Private and Comparative Law, which has the tradition of hosting the event as part of the consortium with the 3 other Canadian centers of jurilinguistics. So I wish to thank them, the Centre for Legal Translation and Documentation, the Centre de Traduction et de terminologie juridique, and the Centre de ressources en français juridique. Today's institute, I hope, will be part of a broader series of events in which the center will try to go beyond the duality of common law et le droit civil in its activities. And among other things, we have begun a project where we wish to translate texts about Indigenous legal traditions and by Indigenous thinkers from English to French and from French to English. I have a particular interest in the connection between law and language, between learning law and learning language. And part of it comes from engaging with and thinking about different languages that I've tried to learn. I'm teaching a seminar on Plato's Republic right now. And in ancient Greek, the verb to show is deiknoumi. And from that verb, we get dike, which we translate as justice. But from there, we also get English word diction, as in diction, which makes jurisdiction feel almost oxymoronic or too much, because the 2 words say the same. So I'm very curious and interested in how, as speakers and learners of different languages, we are introduced to and participants in law in different ways. I'm very grateful to Kirsten for co-organizing this event, to toute l'équipe du Centre Crépeau, Hugo Métivier, qui est le directeur adjoint, qui est présent avec nous, Manon Bertium, la coordonnatrice administrative principale, ainsi que les autres membres de l'équipe. Carrie Sloan could not be with us today, unfortunately. However, we are very fortunate to have Karen Drake, a member of the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation and associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, come to our rescue at the last minute. We are a bit early, but I don't see a problem with getting that first conversation going. So in terms of the structure, there will be one conversation in English. Karen will moderate and participate in it. And then there will be a break and a conversation in French. The participants in the conversations, I think, will probably be the prominent or predominant voices in the first hour. And then we hope there will be plenty of time for responses from those of you who have joined us, whether by chat or by speaking up. So thanks again to everyone for being here, and I turn the virtual floor over to Karen.
Thanks so much, Mark. Ani Bojo, Karen Drake, Indigenous, Wabagoni, Zagagan, Anishinaabeg, Indonjaba, Toronto, Inda. My name is Karen Drake. I'm a faculty member at Osgoode and currently the Associate Dean of Students at Osgoode. I am a member of the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation and I live in Toronto. And I am incredibly grateful to be able to make my livelihood and to live my life in the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And it's my pleasure to serve as your moderator for this panel. And I'm also grateful to be able to learn from and engage with our two panelists today, Lindsay Burrows and Robert Clifford. So what I propose to do is to provide a brief introduction and then turn it over to Lindsay and Robert to tell us a little bit about their journey through learning languages and the relationship of that to law. I've got a few other questions that I want to put towards each of Lindsay and Robert. And then I believe we're going to have time for questions from audience members at the end as well. So as you hear Lindsay and Robert speaking and questions come to mind, please do keep them in mind and feel free to start putting them in the chat and we'll have time to address those. Okay, so first we have Lindsay Burrows, who is Anishinaabe of the Otter Dotem and a member of the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. Lindsay earned her BA in Native American Studies from Dartmouth College and a JD from the University of Victoria. She then practiced Indigenous law and environmental law in Vancouver from 2016 to 2018. She then spent 2 years with the University of Victoria's Indigenous Law Research Unit, providing legal support and research for First Nations, articulating and implementing their Indigenous laws. Since 2020, she's been pursuing graduate studies with the University of Alberta, first completing her LLM and now as a PhD candidate. Her dissertation is on the ways some Indigenous legal traditions conceptualize rights of nature. And as of July 1st, Lindsay will be taking up an appointment as assistant professor with Queen's University's Faculty of Law. Lindsay, I don't think I've had a chance yet to congratulate you on that, so congratulations. Next, we have Robert Clifford. Robert is Wasanich and a member of the Sayout First Nation. He's an assistant professor with the Peter Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. His PhD research uses community participation methodologies to explore the ways Wasanich laws are generated by and reflect the values, philosophies, lands, and worldviews of the Wasanich people. Robert is actively involved in the academic and broader community. He has presented his work widely across academic and professional settings, speaking at community events. His publications cover a range of aspects relating to Indigenous law and legal theory, including on legal pluralism, Indigenous language revitalization, and Indigenous spirituality. In addition to the courses that he teaches at UBC, he has also taught in the JD program at the University of Victoria, most recently a field course in Wasanich law. So welcome very much to you, Robert. Okay, so my first question for each of you is, we would love to hear from you some background on your journey through learning Indigenous law and Indigenous language. So Lindsay, I'm going to turn it over to you first.
Miigwech Karen, Bojon and Dinaway Magani Dog. It's great to be here with you all today. So a bit about the background to my journey learning Indigenous law and language is really a story of family for me. And I was thinking about the ways that our families change from generation to generation as migrations take place and new relationships are formed, and perhaps even different landscapes come into the picture, and what languages and laws are sort of embedded in the soils of those places. And in thinking about Anishinaabe which is one of the indigenous languages around the Great Lakes region that is a language of my family, my grandma was kind of the moment in my family where that language was not passed down anymore. And there were a lot of reasons for that. But as a child, I was, of course, completely unaware. And I'm so interested, I have two small children. I'm thinking about how it is that we learn as children, because so much is kind of unconscious. It just happens, and these different stories and ideas come to us. And I remember being a small child and going to a meeting in the community hall of Neashinigming, where some of my family lives. And it's a big gym. And I brought my coloring book, and I was sitting in there, and people were speaking a language that I didn't know, but these were people that I knew. So they'd always conversed with me in English. And afterwards I talked to my dad, what was going on there? And he was telling me, oh, that's Ojibwe, that's Anishinaabe, that's the language that a lot of your family members speak. And I was interested in that. And then shortly after that, my dad began learning Anishinaabe in a class in Toronto. So in this kind of urban setting, because we didn't live in our home community. And I remember learning to count to 10 and then going to my soccer practice and teaching the girls on my soccer team when we were stretching how to count to 10 in Anishinaabe. So pretty soon we were all, before the game and after the game, stretching there, counting to 10 in Anishinaabe. And I remember my sister was particularly good with the animal names. And so whenever she would see a deer go by, she would yell out, Wawashkeshi, or a crow fly by, and she'd say, Andeg. And so learning was very piecemeal. It was never conversational, like we never got everything together in the syntax and, structures of the language. It was more like we were learning words, individual words in those early years. And then fast forward to my undergraduate years, this kind of idea of language continued to intrigue me. And I did a minor in linguistics. And as part of that, I went to two places. One is I wanted to find a way to actually immerse myself in Anishinaabe. And it proved to be quite challenging for me to find out how to do that as a 20-year-old who was trying to get their education. And I found a university in northern Minnesota, Bemidji State University, that had a great language program. And it was between 3 Anishinaabe reservations. And so I went and I learned, and it was so much fun. And there was a lot of laughter and a lot of friendships and feasts and community. And then interestingly, I also attended language tables in community at that same time. And there was a lot of trauma that was there, and a lot of shame kind of between the people who didn't speak the language, and sort of power dynamics being asserted from those who did know the language. And it was interesting to see these two quite different learning environments. And then I just began writing about this process of learning the language. And then I went to New Zealand to learn about the Kohanga Reo and Kura Kaupapa, which are the Reo, Te Reo Māori, the Māori language immersion schools that are in existence in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I met the leading, at the time anyways, the leading linguist of Proto-Polynesian languages, a wonderful scholar and a wonderful person, Ross Clark. And I was chatting with him and saying, so how many Polynesian languages do you learn? Like which ones do you know? And he was like, oh, I don't speak any of them, but I know really well how they work. And that was like a mind-blowing moment for me, where I realized that you can know so much about a language without being able to speak it. And eventually this drew into law for me, where it's like how sometimes I think Canadian law is quite external from you. You can know a lot about how it works, and it's kind of this system, and it seems like you're kind of looking at it at a bit of a distance. And then learning Anishinaabe law, while there are elements of that, I would say there's also so much of it that's so kind of written on your heart. It's internalized. It's something that you speak and you breathe and has spirit. And that kind of learning of language and law is something that I've continued to grapple with today. So that's a bit about my background into this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Rob, I want to give you a chance to jump in and tell us about your background and your journey learning Indigenous law and language.
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for organizing the panel and for moderating, and happy to be here today. I'm joining from Musqueam territory today. Actually, it's I think this is maybe like my first time in my office, and I've worked here for 2 years now. So strange times, but happy to be here. And so as mentioned, I'm from Husainich, and my journey, trying to figure out how to go about it. I was really interested in Lindsay's story, and I was just kind of engrossed in listening. And then now how to tell my story. I guess it goes back to similar sorts of things. I grew up hearing the language around me, but I didn't grow up speaking it. I didn't, I think there was a lot of trauma around some of that. Obviously, my grandmother went to residential school, so she's from Squamish, and she doesn't speak her language anymore. And my grandfather just went up to grade 3 to avoid going to residential schools. My light turns off in my office every like 10 minutes here. So I don't know why it does that, but apologies if I just got darker. He was a big influence in saving the St. Jothan language, I guess. So St. Jothan is the language of the Husainich people. And at one point there was just a few people left who, even still, I guess there's only a couple who that's their first language. So him and some others, Dave Elliott Sr. and others, started to really expend a lot of energy in trying to think about how they can save the language and do work to pass it on to other generations. Dave Elliott came up with his own St. Jothan alphabet. He was trying to work with the like phonetic system and so forth, but all of the symbols were too difficult and didn't really match some of the sounds that he wanted to make, and just thought it was too complex and expensive and time consuming for people in the community to really kind of use. So he invented his own alphabet and a kind of written system for it. And then my grandfather and him and some others really started working on developing kind of curriculum books and writing down and working with linguists about how the language worked. And now we have a St. Jothan immersion program at the Leilani Travel School which goes up to grade 8, I think now, and they just kind of took a lot of influence from immersion programs in Hawaii and other places where there's the how can we start teaching our kids the language, and didn't ask any permission, just developed this program and had teachers come in and start with immersion program and then kind of keep building teachers each year. So it's just been expanding. So now we have a great deal more second language speakers now. But I sort of fell in the cracks of all that. There was no immersion program yet, and my grandfather would speak St. Jonathan around us, and my parents, my mom as well, but we didn't pick up on it, or we weren't really taught to engage with it, or can't speak it. So I don't know, it's kind of a different dynamic where I saw it around me, and I don't know, I recognized or felt like something very important in it, but I haven't had the chance to learn it. And I'm still just, I kind of like Lindsay mentioned, I pick up words here and there, and I try and think about how it works, and say hello to people around my office in St. Jonathan and so forth. But I really am very, very new to it. But I guess the reason why I wanted to mention a little bit about my grandfather, so I carry his name Milquetza, and I think it's a big part of why I do what I do and how it is that I go about doing it. So names in Saanich and other traditions, I'm sure as well, are very, very important. That connects me to my Nahimit, which is like our ancestral line that gives us certain rights and responsibilities and so forth, connects us to our different societies and societal rights, and fishing locations and all sorts of other things. So names are very, very important. And in carrying his name, I say carry because he had it before, others had it before him, and people will have it after me. I don't think of it as my name so much as something that I'm very honored to carry and to try and hold up in the same way that he did. And he did such amazing work with the language, and trying to envision a Saanich community that could draw strength from that in healing and I guess just being in the world, that I felt very much an obligation to continue on his work, but I suppose I go about it in my own way. So while I'm not a expert in the language, I feel that I'm still am, in looking at the revitalization of Saanich law and how Saanich law works. I very much feel like I'm trying to carry that name in as honorable and respectful way as I can. And it's really a big part of what I do and why I do it. And pushing to learn the language more. It's on my to-do list. I have some relatives around who I'm going to convince that I can just follow them around for a summer, and that they just speak nothing but St. Jonathan to me. And I'll try and pick it up more that way. But as for now, I just try and work with what I do have and what I know, and listening to others. And I guess also realizing that even though I don't speak the language, that there are other important elements, I think, in that as well, like watching people speak it, even though I can only pick up bits. I also notice like the way that they talk, how it is that they carry and present themselves and use their voice to make impact, and all of these sorts of things. So I guess I've come to realize that I also learned a lot in that regard, and just being a particular way, if I can, I suppose. So I guess that's sort of my initial part of my journey. Since Lindsay's here, I should mention that I owe a whole lot to her dad as well. I came to law school thinking about doing Aboriginal law, principally like a branch of Canadian law that deals with Aboriginal peoples. And even though I had these teachings and different kind of elements of culture with my family. I didn't really think of law in that way before I met Lindsay's dad, John, and he kind of pushed me in this very gentle way to start thinking about things a bit differently. And so it was in law school where I really kind of took that up and started thinking about things a bit differently, and to go on my journey of kind of learning and connecting with some of those things that I didn't get as much chance to earlier. Like lots of people, I suppose I wish I asked my grandfather more questions. He passed away the day that I graduated law school, actually. So I just like didn't, through all my graduate studies and like the time of my life where I really had far more focus on trying to learn these things, I couldn't just drop in and ask some questions or listen that I might have wished to otherwise, but I've still learned a great deal from them since then, just in kind of thinking back and pulling out stuff that was already there. I just hadn't thought about it in that way. So yeah, that's kind of, I don't know, my journey in a nutshell, I guess, is very much one about family and a personal path, as Lindsay mentioned as well. It's not, I mean, it obviously does have academic elements to it, but I don't do what I do for those reasons in particular. They're, very personal reasons and very much part of life. And I just kind of see it as a journey of continuing to explore that each day. I feel very lucky and privileged that I get to do that as a job and to help others. I was at a panel here the other day doing my first directed research sort of thing, like with one of the JD students here, and they're doing a paper. I said I'd help do a directed paper with them, and to see those kind of, I did one with Lindsay's dad, John, and I was talking about that. Like this was my first paper on an island in our territory. Maybe I'll mention more about that later. But just to see that role, I feel very lucky to be able to help people along. And she shared deep and meaningful stories. That's not my place to share here, but it's very powerful to see how that path of reconnecting can have such kind of healing and powerful elements to it. So I think I'll stop there because I'm just kind of lost my just blabbing now. So that's a brief introduction to me, but very thankful to be here. So Aishka Siam.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. Okay, so for my next question, I want to ask you to tell us about things that you would like others to understand about the Indigenous language that you're learning. So Lindsay, perhaps I'll turn it back over to you now.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Rob. Listening to you share that, Rob, and then going into this question that you've posed, Karen, it makes me think that one thing that I hope people understand about the Indigenous language I've learned, and it sounds like that Rob is learning too through Sanchothan, is this idea that it's our language and it's living. And so there's stuff you can make up. It's like, what I mean by that is it's like, not like learning the language is just like going back into some like deep, pure historic time. And that there was like this moment before contact where the language was the best and that we're all trying to get back to there. But it's like, as now many of us who are like English speakers or French speakers or whatever languages, there are ways that we can engage with our Indigenous languages and kind of like speak them through the English that we speak. And that's something I explore in my book, Otter's Journey Through Indigenous Language and Law. And I think that's important because we see how the courts in Canada like continually try and freeze Indigenous people into this particular point in time and like want to uphold this vision of this very static way of being. But in fact, the reality is, like, you meet with Anishinaabe youth today who are super into, I don't know, like the kids are into Paw Patrol, like some TV show on Netflix, or like the older ones are really into like Japanese comics, or, you know, there's so much that we can breathe life into through our languages. So on that note, something that I really love about Anishinaabe and how it works linguistically is that it's a very verb-oriented language. And this has become a bit of a party trick for me now, but the word that I really love sharing is blueberry pie, which is chigiyate wemitagoshe minabashke minasagane bichsijikane shikwabekenekane bekwejigan, which means, translated, it's roughly like old-time Frenchmen exploding blueberries, blueberry sauce layered between thing, bend over and put it in the oven bread. And then if you get into the word even deeper, like the word Frenchman, wemitagoshe is how we say it. Mitig is our word for tree, and way is the, it's like a movement, like a waving movement. And so I've learned that wemitagoshe is literally like a tree waver, like a stick waver, because when the missionaries arrived, they had these crosses from their biblical stories around Christ, and that was a main story that they were sharing, and so that became kind of like a representative symbol for the name. I love how there's quite a lot of onomatopoeia in Anishinaabe, so that words sound like what the thing sounds like. So for example, with exploding blueberries, as part of that word, there's minabashke, and bashke is to explode. And I think that bashke just really like sounds a bit like an explosion. So I love that element too. And I think it really impacts how we think about law if we're speaking in a very kind of verb-based, action-oriented world. And so for example, as today when we have powwows, there's usually a giveaway at the end, which is upholding obligations to honor the people who have come to participate and to show generosity and kind of inspire them to live in that way. But our word for, in English, we call it the giveaway. It's this noun, but in Anishinaabe, when it's the giving away, like it's more seen as the action side of it, that in English, when we talk about it as it's time for the giveaway, it becomes like this noun, like this moment of an event that's going to occur, instead of more of a focus on the actual act of it. And I think a lot too about clock time. So this idea that, you know, we have this clock on the top of our computer screen that ticks along, and we look at it all the time, and it tells us when to go different places and when to stop. And we put down in our schedules like so much in relationship to this ticking clock. And I think that Anishinaabe kind of moves us into like beyond clock time. So if you think about using this word again, and you've said blueberry pie, but you've painted this image in people's minds. And the sign of a skilled orator is someone who can do that painting work with words that puts you into a story. And in that sense, when you're engaged in negotiations or consultations or ceremony, clock time is no longer very helpful. Yet there's this strange interplay where it's like, but we're all still so governed by it. And so how today can we use some of these teachings of how, you know, like in the past, I heard stories of people who they would sit down and they would tell stories like all night long. or all day long, or maybe multiple days. And now I don't think we do that as much anymore because we're so tied to our schedules. But I think the language reminds us anyways of what it might be like to step outside of that, even for a little bit, and see what comes through our deliberations if we can do that kind of work. And then the last thing I want to say about this is when I was working as an articled student at West Coast Environmental Law, I was gifted with the honor to learn from Alice William, a member of the Tsilhqot'in Nation, because we had partnered with the Tsilhqot'in national government. And when we told Alice that we needed to learn about Tsilhqot'in laws of consent so that we can draft this consent regime for them, she said, well, we're going to need a horse, we're going to need horses, and we're going to need a boat. And she took us out on the land for almost a month on this horse pack trip. And we had these 3 pack horses, and we each had our horse, and we were moving through the mountains, and I didn't know much about anything about horses, to be honest, before that. And I didn't know anything about their territory, really, beyond what I had read in the Tsilhqot'in title decision from the Supreme Court of Canada. And immediately, she introduced us to Tsilos. And Tsilos is one of the Tsilhqot'in ancestors who now lives as a mountain. And there are particular ways of acting on the land to be respectful towards Tsilos. And so learning that, you know, it's not just a place name, it was like being introduced to that ancestor. And even though I don't know anything about Tsilhqot'in language, knowing the name of Tsilos and makes me think a little bit about, you know, how Rob, you're talking about carrying that important name from your family. I learned a little bit about that important name that the mountain carries, and it really impacted how we moved through the territory. And I have to cough, so I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I'm going to turn it over to Rob in just a second to give you a chance to jump in as well. But before I do, I just want to mention something that Lindsay talked about, which is how verb-based Anishinaabemowin is. So I'm just at the very beginning of doing my best to learn Anishinaabemowin. I've been trying for just over 3 years, but I feel like I'm still a beginner. My teacher told me I had to move up to the intermediate class, and I really didn't want to because it's still such a challenge. But that was something I'd heard so much as well, that this language is verb-based. And it didn't really sink in for me, the extent of that, until we got to the days of the week. And we learned, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in Anishinaabemowin. But the word for Monday wasn't Monday. The word for Monday was, it is Monday. And the word for Tuesday is, it is Tuesday. And to me, that is just so, it's not just that verbs are more prominent, but that things that are nouns in English are simply verbs in Anishinaabemowin. And I'm just interested in thinking more about the significance of that. So I'm going to leave that there for you to think about, Lindsay. But for now, turn it over to Rob. So Rob, what are some things you think that it'd be helpful for others to understand about the Indigenous language that you're learning about, Sinchothan?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this seems to work well. Lindsay goes first and then gets me to actually think about things, and I can just follow up and say things, similar things. But it made me think about a bunch of different things. Kind of following up on this point, I remember I presented a paper at McGill quite some time ago now, I guess. And after I talked, John stood up and he was talking about time. So, you know, Lindsay was mentioning about time, and he was explaining to me that time, when understood through Anishinaabemowin, is a being that you're either in good relationship or bad relationship with. So it's not just this kind of abstract thing out there. But I don't know, I found it really interesting to think about, but also connected with thinking about we have a calendar that we call like our years divided into moons, 13 different moons we have in Husinich, and they're very closely tied to a governance structure as well, that brings certain ceremonial, spiritual, and legal, economic activities and throughout the territory to different places at different times and in different relationships. And I was thinking about this, like we have a lot of onomatopoeia as well. So one of our moons is called Wachis. It's the moon of the frog. And that sound makes me very much think of a frog. If you're like Wachis, 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 just like the sound of frogs. And that moon is not just like this happens at exactly this day or whatever. It comes about when the frogs call that season, right? When you go out and you start to hear the frogs, and then you're moving into the season of Wachis, and then that's, that comes after winter and ceremonial dances, and it's, it signals a time to stop doing certain things and brings you into a different element of governance and economy and so forth. Start preparing for spring and different things happening at that time of year, which is everything's so, I guess, all kind of tied up in the way that you talk about that season, but then also in terms of law, the things that you come about, right? Like when you have, especially when it's time to start fishing and so forth, right? There's so many different laws and ceremonies and so forth that are triggered by watching things around you. Like I was told when the ocean spray plant is blooming is when the peak of the sockeye run is, which is when you go out and catch the first fish, and then you have the first salmon ceremony, and different things, because we use a reef net fishing technology that we speak about as being gifted to us by the salmon people, when someone in our village married one of the salmon people when they came in human form, and that was gifted to us. But it also makes me think that we have different words for the same sort of thing, right? Like, so our most the fish species that we hold in the highest esteem, I guess, is sockeye salmon around here, which we call kleki. But whenever you're going to do these ceremonies, for instance, it's not that word that you use. You use different prayer words that I won't say, but essentially that one translates into I'm your pitiful one. It's what we would which is just really a reflection of how, being a saltwater people, how dependent we were relied on salmon for our very livelihood. I guess that was such a critical part. But we do that with other things as well. Like, so we would call qua water if you're just drinking water. It's, water is qua, or to drink is qua, or qua drinking. But we also have in our laws and winter ceremonies and so forth, bathing ceremonies, which are very important. But when you're doing those bathing ceremonies, you refer to water slamuch instead, which we speak of as being our very first ancestor who came to the earth in the form of rain and helped form the world, the lakes, the rivers, the streams, the ocean, and so forth. So giving certain teachings at that time. So when you're in relationship with water during ceremony like that, that's the word that you use instead, kind of reflecting on those stories, those teachings, that relationship. The same is with deer. Like, we have our creation story of deer is about our creator Hales was walking the earth, and there was a Senate man named Smythe who heard that Hales was transforming people into land and animals into people and transforming things. But Smythe didn't want to be transformed, so he's planning to kill Hales instead. That didn't go so well, obviously. But he was ended up being transformed into the deer. So when we say the word deer, Smythe, we can think of those stories. I won't get into it, but again, when it comes time to hunting, we don't use the word Smythe when hunting because it brings to mind or kind of reflects on this notion of him trying to kill the creator with no particular reason, this notion of killing just for sport or fun or whatever, whereas hunting is meant, that's not what hunting is about. You don't just go out and kill something just for fun, right? You're taking the life of a deer because that's what's providing the sustenance for your life. There's various protocols and ceremonies about fasting and so forth, but you use the word ingas instead, which means grandson or grandchild when you're hunting. So it's more thinking about a relationship where, like, being a relative and so an important relationship, but also that brings to mind, like, maybe that time in Smythe's life, there's a certain kind of wisdom and knowledge that grandparents can, when you're just a kid, you're running around doing whatever just because it seems like something to do at the time. Like, I don't know, it's not always fully thought out. But anyways, my point is we just have lots of different words, that there's not just a word for something and then that's the thing, right? Like, as in kind of like objectifying it, that there's much more of a relational sort of thing going on with naming. The same goes with place. Like, sometimes I use the example of, name places after significant people or whatever. Like in our territory in Saanich, which is near Victoria, British Columbia, Queen Victoria, and we have mountains named after Sir James Douglas, and all of these sorts of things that are just so very problematic for us, I guess, and arrogant, I would say too, probably. It just doesn't reflect how we name places. The name of a place is very much based on its own kind of characteristics, sometimes descriptive, like we have a creek named which is like the sound it makes when it's hitting onto the beach or whatever, or the creation story of that island I mentioned, Cheltas, which means splashed on the face, because a word for island, Cleches, means relative of the deep, and ancestors who'd been thrown out to make those islands, and depending on how they landed and their own unique characteristics, that one's kind of splashed on the face, I guess. So, I mean, I'm just like rattling off a bunch of things, but I guess my main point is, what would I want people to know about the language is that it's, I suppose it's very, very relational in that regard, I guess, that there's not just one word for one thing, and that the way that we think about and talk about place or other beings is has a lot underneath it and going on kind of behind it with our stories. Like, all the place names have particular creation stories attached to them and things that so when you look at a place name, it's, there's so many of those creation stories that attach to it and these other ways of thinking about and relating to place. So yeah, there's a lot of different layers to it, I guess. Yeah, I'll stop there, I guess, but that was helpful.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rob. Okay, so my next question is really getting at the heart of what this panel is about, and that's the interconnection or interaction between Indigenous law and Indigenous language, in particular the Indigenous law and language that you are learning and that you are engaged with. And so you've been talking about this a little bit already, but I want to encourage you to draw this out more explicitly. And in particular, to talk about how this might be similar and or different from Canadian law and Canadian English language, and or perhaps French. And so, for example, mainstream legal education, so education with respect to Canadian law, is focused on law as a profession of words, right? So in law school, we focus on interpretation, drafting, argument. So do you think that the law and language of your Indigenous nation is similar or different from the relationship between Canadian state law and French or English? So perhaps I'll just continue with the same order and turn over to you first, Lindsay.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, this is such a good question, and I think it's kind of like it's the hard one. And so from my understanding of Anishinaabe law, I do think that sometimes it is a practice of interpretation, drafting, and argument. So I think about the White Earth Anishinaabe Nation in Minnesota, who recently drafted a bill protecting minomen, which is wild rice. And in the bill, they essentially designated the wild rice as a legal person. And to do that, that bill that's coming from their kind of version of a legislative body at White Earth Nation looks a lot like a bill that you would encounter in a Canadian law school. And so I think Anishinaabe language and law has the capacity to look quite similar to how French or English might look in an expression of common law or civil law. And the reason why I say that is because there's so many nations who are doing that. And I think that to say like that's not Anishinaabe law would be to say then that, I don't know, that seems too limiting to me. To say that that's not Anishinaabe law. So there's that. But then also something I'm really intrigued about and that I'm writing a lot about through my graduate work is people say that Anishinaabe is an earth-based language, and that likewise Anishinaabe law is earth-based. When I was growing up, you know, a robin might fly by and a family member, well, mostly my dad, would say, oh, there goes a flying case, because we have a story about that robin that teaches us certain obligations for how it is we need to live in the world. And without that robin flying by, we might not remember that story and the teachings that are attached to it. And then we might forget what our obligations are. Or Basil Johnston, who was the late Basil Johnston, he used to have these books at his house filled with Anishinaabe stories, both in English and French. It's the William Jones text, for those of you who know it. And he had all those stories memorized in both languages. And he would say that was his case book. I've also heard him refer to it as his Bible. And, you know, I think a Bible and a case book, maybe there is quite a bit in common there, in the sense that it's something that you believe to be authoritative. It's full of kind of fact patterns that you can then engage with and reason by way of analogy to figure out how you should be patterning your own life. And so through the earth being a case book, and that the earth doesn't speak in any particular language, yet we're always mediating our experiences through language. So how Anishinaabe understands the language of the earth is going to be different from how other linguistic and cultural practices understand those stories of the earth. And I was once working with a group of preteens at a summer camp, and I was telling them about the Whanganui River in New Zealand and how it was given legal personhood. And I was saying, how do you think you can learn how to speak for the river? Or who should do that? And the kids had all these great ideas. And one of them said, oh, I think the person in the community who most acts like that river should be the one to speak for the river. They were just like really grappling with how do you do this work of, I guess, like listening to the earth if the language is so different. And I'm spending so much time on this because, right, like all these indigenous legal traditions, however many hundreds of years ago, didn't have like the type of written language that we have today. We had storytelling devices in the earth. We had some nations, we had our wampum belts, which are beads that are beaded together to tell a particular story between groups, maybe between nations. We had birch bark scrolls in Anishinaabe law. We had art, I think, was another way to pass along law. In the West Coast, there's so many dances and carvings that have certain stories attached to them that pass down law and are performed in very particular moments of legal process. So all of this to say that Indigenous law can sometimes like first act without language, but then language sort of comes in as we make meaning. And that's where I think the words interpretation, drafting, and argument seem a bit limiting because story is so much more than that. How you might describe a dance or a pole or a wampum is, it might have those elements where people are interpreting it and maybe arguing around it, but it's less of a kind of sit down with your heads in the books kind of activity. So yeah, I'll go there and hear what you have to think, Rob, and if you find it similarly hard.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lindsay. Okay, so yeah, over to you now, Rob. So what are your thoughts on the interaction, the entwinement between law and language for you?
Yeah, I mean, this is I have some thoughts on it. It's maybe a harder question, just in the sense that, like, I'd probably like to know more about, there's probably so much on the side of Canadian law and language, and there's just lots to think about in this question. And but sometimes I reflect back on a couple points and maybe tendencies that I see or think of in Canadian law sometimes, which is, and just going back to my experience in law school and something that one of my teachers told me about, but it's this kind of notion of compartmentalizing or kind of narrowing in versus this notion of expanding outward and opening up. So, you know, and I guess I could give the language example first, which is, his name's Kevin Paul, and it's, so this is all just his take on it, but I've kind of used it as something that I thought about a fair amount, but he uses the word Tanuks in St. Jonathan, which means earth knows, and I don't know, I wrote about this in something a little bit. So in English, it's the word mallard. So he says in English, you can use the word mallard and it brings to mind the image of the duck and so forth. That at most, that's kind of what it will do. You'll think duck, image of duck with the green head kind of thing, like whatever, right? And he says, but if you're going to use the word Tanuks and in St. Jonathan, it kind of opens up to all these other layers. It means, as I said, it means earth knows, because, you know, ducks come into our territory at a particular time of year when they're migrating and they're feeding and they're walking around like with their beaks to the ground, like eating the grains and seaweeds and stuff, which is when it's the best time to hunt them and eat them. So it brings us into the time of hunting for the ducks, but then ducks' feathers are a very sacred ceremonial thing in our winter dances. And he talks about all these other layers that when you use the word Tanuks, and it kind of expands outwards into this kind of like the 13 moons calendar that I talked about. It's a particular time of year and a particular when the ducks are doing this, and then into these ceremonies, and it's opening up into all of these other layers. So he's talking about how to use that word and to really understand what it means or what it's relating. It kind of makes you a participant in the language, I think is how he frames it. Like you understand it by, like, at the depth of all those layers, by these are the things that we're doing and the way that we're engaging in these different levels of the relationship at that time of year. Whereas he sees the word mallard as being just kind of like that descriptive of thing, object or whatever, right? There's the duck. So I kind of started thinking about this in terms of law revitalization too, with how in law school, we're taught to look for ratios and cases and different sorts of things. It's always this process of narrowing down, even, like you go to contracts class and then torts, and then I forgot, maybe not everyone here is a lawyer or went to law school, but torts, I didn't even know what a tort was when I went to law school. Like, it's such a confusing thing to me. But you have all these compartmentalized things, but I find that very hard to do in the same way when I'm thinking about percentage law and different elements of it. I mean, I'd love to learn more about how that works in the JID program, and that's probably a struggle at times, and then other times it works out well. But when I wrote my LLM thesis on a fuel spill at the Gold Stream River, and I remember I sat down with one of the elders and I said, can you tell me a little bit about this river? And he started talking about islands and deer and all of these other kind of things, and he did that for quite a long time. And he said, you wanted me to tell you about a river, but I had to tell you about this other stuff first before you could understand anything about that. So I just really found that this kind of, when I look at a story or a percentage story, that I don't really necessarily think of them as doing that narrowing down to a ratio in the same way, but that they're leading us, that they've always been leading us to the relational side of things, that they're kind of always pointing beyond themselves to relationships that you have to embody and engage in and be a part of, and that's where the true and deeper understanding of that. I mean, it's not that you can't draw things out of it and they point you, but I think maybe, as Lindsay mentioned right at the start, like there's this level of kind of internalizing it and making it a part of your heart, and that the stories, to really, when they're really doing their most significant work, is when you take them that way and you can sit with them and think of them, of what does it actually mean to think of water as our first ancestor or an island as a relative or so forth, and then how does that impact and reflect upon your decision making and the way that you speak about and think of yourself in the world. It's very different than thinking of an island as a rock or inanimate object sitting out there in the ocean. You're not propelled or obligated to think of the way in which you react or in relationship with that rock in any particularly deep way, if that's the way that you think about it, right? So I guess, I'm not saying that it's hard to make a generalization in that English language and Canadian law necessarily always does this narrowing or misses any of that. Maybe it's probably a lot more complicated than that, but I've just found it useful to think of maybe some of these differences or different kind of trajectories that each can tend to take, perhaps, or that we fall into or maybe have forgotten, right? Like, it's not that English words don't have a etymology that you could trace back and understand in different ways, but it's also not the case that most people think of the words in that way anymore, I don't think. Whereas when I listen to people speaking St. Jonathan are talking about a concept around the community, and they talk about islands as relatives. They're not just using the word "cleches" to mean island in some abstract sense. They then go on to talk about, here's how I think of that island, and here's what we have to do to relate to that island in a particular way. So that kind of the etymology of tracking that back to be cleches, to be relatives of the deep, that's very much still there, front and center and guiding the way that that word is used and understood. Yeah, maybe I'll just stop there, but that's kind of one of the things I think of and how they perhaps relate, or there's some difference. But again, I'd be happy just to learn more about people who think about English language and Canadian law, and how there's probably different instances of that, I would guess. But so yeah, I'll stop there though.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. For both Lindsay and Rob, I have a number of thoughts that have come out of what you've said, and if there's time, I have some follow-up questions as well. But I know that there are other questions that you've been thinking about, so I want to give you a chance to speak to those, and also then open it up for audience members to ask questions as well. So next, I want to give you a chance to talk about the importance of language revitalization efforts and what those look like, and perhaps any experience you have with those. So Lindsay, perhaps over to you first.
Thanks. Yeah, this is so rich. I feel like it's hard to move from one question to the next because so much is still left from the other question. But so language revitalization efforts. Yeah, I went through a period of being really fascinated by what's going on globally in various efforts to revitalize kind of endangered languages. So not all Indigenous languages are endangered. And I actually recently, Thomas Snow, who's Stony Nakota, we were in a conversation around Indigenous revitalization of something or other. And he very strongly said, like, oh no, we need to talk about this as Indigenous continuity. Like, this practice was never lost. And it's ongoing today. And that's just stuck with me in thinking about language revitalization, where some communities, it's there in these sort of like moments of continuing with what they had, whereas others are in this moment of revitalization. So I think where I'm seeing a lot of these revitalization efforts for Anishinaabe is in urban centers. Like Karen's so lucky getting to live in Toronto, where you can go to these language courses. And I know at UVic, University of Victoria, which is in Coast Salish territories, there is an Anishinaabe language table there. So it doesn't have to be, people move around and are learning language in all of these sort of different spaces. And so these kind of community language learning nights seem to be something that's quite common, that I'm finding is important, but it's not a way to fluency, I would say, because it's so different when you're in context, living life with people on the day-to-day who speak like this. And there's some beautiful immersion Anishinaabe camps that take place on the land in various parts of Anishinaabe territory. And you like sign a pact before going that you're not going to speak anything but Anishinaabe, which for many people means they don't speak for 3 weeks, or they like speak very little. And it's very uncomfortable to not know how to speak, but then also so powerful and humbling and fun and life-changing. Like, there's so much all within that experience. And I hope that those kind of immersion opportunities will continue to blossom in different parts of Anishinaabe territory. And then in my book, Otter's Journey Through Indigenous Language and Law, I drew a lot on Joshua Fishman's work. He was a linguist who specialized in revitalization and like what are the different steps that are necessary to get from someone who doesn't speak to a full-fledged speaker. And he's very like a mathematician doing language and how he does this, where there's like x plus y equals this. So for example, once you have the language being spoken in the workplace, then you need to have your banking operations available in the language. And he goes through kind of step by step how you build up to full fluency. And I found out about him because he was the one who the Maori language revitalization advocates were really drawing from when they were setting up their system in New Zealand, which I think has the advantage of, you know, that's the only language in that's the only Indigenous language in New Zealand. Whereas in Canada, that's not the case here. You can't just have one language. In New Zealand, they'll say, oh, well, like Maori's very tribal, we have different dialects. And it's like, well, no, you can all still understand each other. Whereas like, you know, Haida and Tanaha are like language isolates. There's no other language that's related to those. But then we have this huge Algonquian language family that goes across kind of from like, yeah, the Atlantic seaboard over into Western Alberta, even into a little bit of Northeastern BC with some Soto speakers up there. We have the Athabascan language, which the Tsilcoteans speak. Athabascan is also up in the Northwest Territories in terms of the language family, but the Navajo down in the Southwestern United States in that desert country are also Athabascan speakers. So the migration story here, I think creates a unique picture for language revitalization when we're thinking about where do funds go. And I think it needs to be really localized is going to be important for us here, of getting money into local communities' hands so that they can develop the resources that are necessary for their members, and then finding ways to build out more broadly from that place. Yeah. Oh, and then in terms of the legal revitalization side of things, this is where I think like the JID is so interesting in terms of education. The JID is a joint in law degree at the University of Victoria that is in the common law as well as Indigenous legal traditions, Indigenous laws. And Rob taught I guess that wasn't for the JID, was it? Your Wasanich Field School, but nonetheless, like taught kind of an immersion field school course for the students, and then is doing that now at UBC. And I've been involved with Karen, actually. We've been doing 4-day Anishinaabe law camps, which is like 4 days of immersion in kind of thinking through what this legal tradition might look like. And so, yeah, I think schools are starting to find ways to immerse people in Indigenous law. And then within communities, I think there's, again, like back and forth happening, where it's like sometimes you're talking about an Anishinaabe law from these kind of unique Anishinaabe legal principles, but then back to that point of how do we speak English in Anishinaabe ways when we're doing that work of the interpretation and drafting and argument, like we're doing that in Anishinaabe ways. And yeah, it's a bit more trans-systemic. Okay, over to Rob.
Wonderful, thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, please go ahead, Rob. We'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the importance and nature of revitalization efforts.
Yeah, I I touched a little bit on the language revitalization happening in Saanich with the St. Jonathan immersion program. Though, I mean, I think one of the strengths and the way that something that those who worked on it emphasizes that they didn't, it's at a tribal school, so in a sense that goes back, you know, that have the space and ability to at least somewhat design curriculum and teach community members and how we wish to, I guess. But another big part of it has been there was an emphasis on not asking permission about, can we set up an immersion program, or how do we go through all this, like jumping through the hoops of it all. The people that did it just started an immersion program and just said, we're just going to keep building this. There's no kind of looking or for approval or for anything else elsewhere, which, I mean, creates some challenges, and you need to have the capacity to kind of do that and to fund it and so forth. But I suppose it's been just a very kind of grassroots revitalization effort, which has been working well so far. I mean, I think some of the challenges that are faced with that, with the language revitalization, is sometimes, and maybe this will change over time, right? But lots of times the kids learn to speak it at school, but then you go home and the parents can't speak it because of, you know, colonial history and so forth. So you're left in a space where you can use it in some context, but you can't really, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear more about this. Maybe we're missing the Y between the X and the Z or something, that be able to go home and speak it at home as well. Or maybe that's just down the road where the kids of these kids will be able to go home and speak it. But nonetheless, there's, you know, it becomes a challenge in that regard. The other challenge, you know, with colonialism and all the things around it, right, is that sometimes I think while being at the tribal school and learning the language can be very empowering for lots of the kids, there's also sometimes it's, you know, I was just talking with the principal the other day, it's also, you know, this is just a tribal school. What if this isn't a very good school? Why do I have to learn this? And there's kind of like this shame around it, that, you know, this school is not as good as the English speaking one down the road or whatever. And I think that is obviously a challenge times as well. And you know, a sad thing that it has to come to that, where you can feel kind of ashamed or lesser because you're at your community tribal school learning that thing, I guess, which I hadn't really thought about as much before. Like he just mentioned it to me the other day because he wanted me to come teach at the school, and I can't say I probably don't have time to do that, I don't think. But thank you very much for thinking of me. I try and do some talks and stuff when I can. But so I mean, there are a lot of challenges with it, I suppose, and same with one of the teachers. He's probably around my age. He spent a lot of time with we have the immersion program, but there's also a master apprentice program that they have there, where you can get partnered up with an elder and they just speak St. Jonathan to you. He went through that program and you just kind of learn in that way. But since he had his daughter, I don't know, she's probably 9 or something now, he's chosen to speak nothing but St. Jonathan to her since the day she was born. So it's been very helpful that way. But he wanted to try and bring that into other parts of his life. He's like, what if I just spent a week or a day where I only spoke St. Jonathan? But then if you go to any of the stores or anywhere else, right, there's so few people that you can speak it to that it becomes difficult. You can only practice with a small group of people that can understand you. And obviously most people who have stores around the community are English speaking people. So plenty of challenges, I guess, but hopefully that just keeps growing. for the law revitalization, I really struggle with this one. In the sense, I mean, because I guess I get too goal-oriented sometimes, I suppose, in the sense, like, if I think of, I have an obligation to care for salmon or for water or so forth, how can I do that? Like, not just in my own actions, but actions of others, right? So I spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, colonial structures, but also global climate change and so forth, and acidification of oceans and declining stocks that are just from such diffuse, like, spatially and temporal harms, right? That how can I think about revitalizing and upholding these laws of care with place when those places are so entangled in just this massive web of power dynamics and different relationships that I find it struggling. I find it hard sometimes, but then I remember that it's not so much the end result, but that constant remembering and kind of attempt to uphold that I try and focus on, I guess. So I think that comes through in a lot of smaller ways as well. I know that the students that have done that, the field school that I teach, you know, not just me, but it's a month-long intensive land-based course, and then followed by other community. So it's a semester-long course, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, just on revitalizing Saanich law. But I bring elders along. So whenever we go to a place, I always bring elders with us on all our different trips and outings. And I know that the students that have gone through that have had very kind words to say and saw it as being a very impactful thing for them in the way that they think about law and their studies and so forth. So I'm biased, obviously, but I think that when you can have that element of, you know, not just hearing about Saanich law, but to go out to the places, where these creation stories are, and to be out on the water and to think about these relationships in a different way and in kind of an embodied way. When I mentioned bathing ceremony earlier, like on our first full day, I get the students out into the cold ocean water in the morning and say, here's what we think about water. Those stories, and like to actually start to really to feel that as well, and to see those tankers going by just off there and all these other sorts of things. So I don't know, I think that's a big part of it, because it's that first step in that kind of internalizing, like not just understanding it up here, but understanding it here as well. And I think that has a big role in the revitalization aspects as well. But I'll stop there because I know there's questions and I want to leave time for those as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rob. So yeah, I think I'm going to turn over to the audience for questions now, and there are already questions in the chat, so perhaps I'll start there, but feel free as well if you'd like to use the raise hand feature and ask your question orally. So one question I see in the chat asks, how does the different approach impact the arguments that you might present in a case? So in particular in court, given that the Canadian legal system might sometimes need to be used. So does this approach make you want to bring something different into the Canadian legal system compared to what you would if you were simply working with Canadian law, and how? So I guess either Lindsay or Rob, is this something that you'd like to speak to?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a wonderful question and something I have lots to learn about yet, but some things that, so yes, I think this approach does certainly make an impact on the types of arguments you make in court and how to present. And there are very particular rules of evidence in Canada around how you can put forward arguments in formal court settings. And some things that uplift me that I've seen lawyers, or I've heard of lawyers doing to advance Indigenous legal arguments is when the Tsilhqot'in title case was going on, they held some of those court hearings in Hanigwitine, which was the Tsilhqot'in community, and they held those hearings at nighttime because that was the time that you're culturally meant to tell stories. And so the Canadian court system, like the judge, was able to accommodate that Tsilhqot'in legal process of telling cases by having it in community, having it at night. I heard from Louise Mandel, who was one of the lawyers that argued the Haida case, which was another Supreme Court of Canada decision, that they got like huge blow up photos of those Haida villages of, I'm not sure what year it was from, but like a long time ago, with the amazing poles and lodges and all these people standing out there. Like they were just huge villages. And then they put them up in the courtroom so that those images of Haida territory were really in people's minds because they couldn't go up. They couldn't go into a time machine and go into the past, and then they also couldn't go up to Haida Gwaii, where the Haida live. So that was a way of kind of bringing the affect of those poles and the regalia and the village structures into the courtroom through imagery. We've also seen in kind of the Robinson-Huron Treaty court case that's been going on, a lot of the legal process there was engaging with Anishinaabe law through having ceremony be a part of that case. I heard that there were sweats that were held where different Crown Counsel also went into sweat with some of the other lawyers and community members. And it's very challenging as a judge to do this because, right, you're meant to be unbiased, and unbiased in Canadian law is to only know Canadian law. And so for her stepping into sweat and learning those Anishinaabe ceremonial proceedings, she had to make sure that she didn't take into account any of the evidence, any of these laws that were being passed down outside of the courtroom. Otherwise, she'd be acting illegally. So it's a real area of kind of creativity and carefulness needs to be there, thoughtfulness needs to be there. And I think it's exciting though, because we are seeing different approaches to bringing Indigenous law into the courtroom in Canada.
Great, thanks so much, Lindsay. Rob, do you have thoughts on this question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I remember Louise Mandel also, she did the Sanishton Bay Marina case, which is one of the cases here in Usainich, and I forget what they call it, but they had a site visit, I guess. They got the judge to be out on a boat in Sanishton Bay, like with elders talking and listening about the things that we were saying in court, I guess. And I think she felt that was a pretty central or important part in that case, and coming down on the right side of things for us. So I mean, I think it can be helpful in that regard. Sometimes I got asked to present at the National Energy Board on behalf of SAOT for the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, or I guess more specifically our what's the word? We didn't want the expansion. And we opened with a song about the 13 Moons. One of the youth did a drum and song, 13 Moons song about that. And I told them that it's meant to be about opening hearts and minds, and that this was something to kind of really open up and not just hear us, but to understand why this deeply matters to us. I had a few problems. Well, one thing, the National Language Board has never not approved a project. So, I mean, and they stuck with their trend on that one. And then if you look at the transcripts, it just says brackets and it says song or whatever. And like, that's what the transcript will say to anyone else. And I was like, I just don't know. I have a problem when part of my concern is when it gets treated as evidence, right? Like we're talking about a legal order that has jurisdiction and legitimacy over these lands, not just some evidence into a court process. So, I mean, I don't think I need to get into it too much, but I would say that I have very strong doubts on whether Canadian courts will fix the issues that we have here. I don't have much, I don't know. I don't want to word it too strongly, but I have concerns about whether or not that can solve the biggest, the principal issues that are at play, I guess. Particularly with this kind of, I don't know what, and part of it is that once we start thinking global climate change stuff as well, that I think we just need very foundational and far reaching changes as opposed to kind of tweaks of the status quo, I guess. So I suppose my end goal or like visions see probably broader and sweeping changes than are likely to come from Canadian courts, I guess partially because it'll be different in various areas where there's different treaties and so forth. We have Douglas treaties, but they're kind of more like, there's a big difference between the written version and the oral version, but oftentimes I don't yet understand how it is that Canadian courts have any legitimacy or authority over Indigenous lands. So minus grappling with that question, which the court kind of seems to constantly sidestep, you're not really dealing with the underlying root of things, I guess. So I'd much prefer to kind of get to the point where we can just have that conversation about how can we all live together more effectively and in much better ways than just pretending like that's not a reality, I guess. But yeah, I'm just going to stop there.
Thank you. Very helpful. Okay, so I'm going to continue on with audience questions. And again, feel free to either put them in the chat or to use the raise hand feature if you like. So another question I see in the chat here says that French was lacking technical and scientific terms in the 1960s. So the Office de la Langue Française was founded to create new terms. Is anyone creating modern technical vocabulary in Indigenous languages? So either Lindsay or Rob, I don't know if either of you want to speak to this.
Sure, yes, there definitely, an Anishinaabe is the only language that I can speak to on this, but there are many new terms that are being created, and it does create the issue because Anishinaabe territory is so vast, and you know, there's a US-Canadian border that's kind of dissecting communities from one another. So if someone makes up the word for computer, how do you tell those people in like Northern Ontario down to kind of like Southern Minnesota or something what our agreed upon word is? And so I think there are some instances where we're seeing more kind of like regional words that are popping up for these new languages. We don't have an office that is created for this yet, because of technology and how people are so often on like social media, or there's this online Ojibwe dictionary that's become really popular. Those types of kind of technological communication sources are, I think, kind of narrowing down the regionalness and finding ways to create new terms across the board that can speak to this. And like when we were, I think sometimes communities have sort of language councils. sometimes, and they'll come if a word needs to be they need to come up with something, then they might go to that like community language council, but it's not something that's super formalized in what I've seen.
Great, thank you. Rob, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so it's a little bit easier in that the Sanchothan language, although it's going to be somewhat similar to Hokamilum speaking people and so forth, but we're talking about a much smaller geographical area here. So it's probably a little bit easier to all stay on the same page. I think there was some talk about setting up a group that would, I'm trying to keep things consistent, I guess, but I do find it interesting about how the new terms are, there's some notion of trying to find a new term, but talk about it in a way that makes sense to, like, in the language and the worldview in general, you know, like, what is it? I can't remember, like, one example is dragon, like because they're translating children's books into Sanchothan, so I think it was like the paper bag princess or whatever, and there's the dragon. It's like, what do we call a dragon? And then it's like, so then that's just going to be like fire monster or whatever. And then other things with computers, I forget what the computer was, but it's a sort of like Lindsay's blueberry pie example, right? Like sometimes you're piecing together these things that are like, how do we understand computer? And you know, it's like this. Yeah, I don't know. So I find it interesting the way that you kind of infuse this worldview into these new terms and then try and keep them consistent. But so that is happening. It's a lot easier for us to keep it consistent. There's a bit of a language committee, I guess, through the Sandwich Leadership Council that you know, something's happening where they need input from fluent speakers or from people who are really well versed in the language. There's, you know, it can kind of get put to them and they can come back with some input on things and so forth. But it's not I wouldn't say we have a fully formalized group that makes all these decisions, but being that many of our fluent speakers work at or are otherwise connected with the tribal school and the immersion program and so forth, it's a lot easier to stay on a similar page, I think. So
Great, thank you. Okay, so we just have, I think, around 7 more minutes left. And so I'm going to ask you the last 2 questions that I see in the chat here. So first is the question, can you elaborate on the concept of Indigenous rights within the Canadian legal system? Should there be cultural rights and rights for the environment? So I'm going to ask you that first. And then the final question, just so they can start to think about it, is the last question I see in the chat, which is, what can you recommend to audience members who are interested in furthering their education on these topics? Okay, but first the question about Indigenous rights and should there be cultural rights and rights for the environment. So Lindsay, I do know that you have a lot to say about this, so perhaps I'll leave it to you to answer this one first.
I was just thinking, oh, I don't really have anything to say about this. No, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about rights for the rights of nature movement that's happening globally, that lots of Indigenous people seem to be really jumping on board with. So especially like in the United States recently, we've seen, I gave the wild rice example, salmon in the West have recently been declared by a nation as a legal person. The Klamath River has been declared a legal person. Globally, like Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, already talked about New Zealand. There's all these different Indigenous nations who are kind of taking up this rights of nature rhetoric. So I think that should it be introduced in the Canadian legal system? I think that it depends. I think I suppose I'm sort of like community driven by it. Like if some nations want that, like the Innu in Quebec recently were part of the Magpie River Declaration, declaring that river, who's one of their ancestral relations as a legal person. In that sense, it made sense because it fit with their kind of legal cosmology. The process of going about it felt good to them. They were involved from, you know, they were co-leading that effort. But we haven't seen other nations yet taking that up. So I don't think that it should be something that everyone just jumps on board with. But I think if there are people who think that it's important and want to do that kind of rights-based approach to protecting the land and themselves, their cultural selves, then that's something that I think is great to do if they decide that as one layer of protection, because we know that in law, just because you say something is protected, it doesn't necessarily mean it is. There's so much more at play in terms of power dynamics.
Great, thank you. Rob, I want to give you a chance to jump in if you have thoughts on this question as well.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I've given quite a bit of thought to the rights of nature stuff as well, and I find it interesting. I mean, I guess first on the kind of the cultural rights thing and Indigenous rights, I guess the one kind of thing that I worry about sometimes is this kind of say with like a cultural right, this to maybe not to have it switch too much out of the fact that there's they're really kind of what we're looking for or what's at stake is like political authority or decision making power, or I guess jurisdiction, right, to like speak that these are the laws that are in operation over these lands. And so not so much a rights thing per se, like a right within a Canadian legal tradition, but rather political authority to speak which laws are applicable on these lands. But in terms of the rights of the environment thing, it's also, I guess I agree with, probably find myself similar. Like I think there's space for it. And as far as innovative approaches, it's been an important and a huge one in the sense that 99% of the globe is claimed to be owned by human beings or whatever, I guess, as some form of property or whatever, which David Boyd here at UBC just, I think in his book, The Rights of Nature, describes that as like a breathtaking arrogance, I guess, or something along those lines, which I just like have to find myself agreeing with. So making a dent in this notion of property or ownership over the more than human world and nature and so forth, I find to be important and something consistent with when I talked about thinking of land and other beings as relatives. So there's something very important and innovative in that. I also think it can be useful in the sense that sometimes, there's been this big push for like land back, for instance, but land back sometimes comes with all kinds of red tape around it too, right? Like the requirement to put these restrictive environmental covenants or other sorts of things. It doesn't usually just come back in a particular way. So that's just how it worked in New Zealand, right? Te Urawa was going to be given back to the Maori iwi, but they considered that to be a bridge too far to cross, I think was the wording. Just to give it straight back was too much. So let's turn it into its own legal person is what they decided to do instead. So I mean, there's definitely a role for it, but it's also has its limits in a couple senses. One, personhood has always already been a gendered, racialized, hierarchical concept, right? That just because you're a person doesn't mean that you're treated equally. Also, this like to be a person, it rests on this other kind of binary, right? Like to be a person means that there's something else that isn't a person. It's not this, it's pretty far removed from this other relational ontology that would say that everything is sacred or everything is kind of, that relationships foreground objects or whatever. I don't want to get into too much of the philosophy of it all, but this notion of personhood is already a significant departure in important ways, I think, than what just taking an Indigenous worldview, or like if you take some of the things that Lindsay said at the beginning about this verb-oriented thing, or seeing other things as beings, there's lots to be thought about there as well. It's not quite getting you all the way there, I don't think, I guess. So so I think it can be an innovative and important thing, and it's something that we've looked at in Husainich, for instance, as being sometimes there's some of the islands that we're trying to get back what it's mean to maybe to declare those legal persons, or whether certain protections might come from declaring Cathalmachin, southern resident killer whales, as legal persons, being an endangered species, and trying to think about what kind of protections might be there. Sometimes I also remember that it's not, once you remove the fact that it's not all about us, right? Like going down the rights-based path might not be always the most ideal for percentage self-determination efforts, I guess. But it's not all just about percentage, right? If I talked about, we saw J35, that southern resident killer whale, carrying her young dead calf for 17 days, saying like, I need something here, right? It's not just about us. It's about what might we have to do to help put some protections in place for that, our relatives, Cathalmachin, whether it's a perfect solution or not, maybe not, but maybe that's just what we're being called to do right now, to put in some help. So it's not just, there are a lot of tough decisions, and lots of times they're more political decisions, and there's no one answer that's just going to solve it all, right? Like if we just put legal personhood of the environment out there, it's not going to solve the fact of massive inequalities and global capitalist relations and relying on fossil fuels and all of those sorts of things, right? That are for very big problems. So yeah, I'll stop there. That's kind of my thoughts on that one. A good tool, but not the final answer.
Great.
I could have said it in 5 seconds, but there you go.
Thank you so much, Rob. So that brings us to the end of our time. So I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to answer the final question about additional resources by holding up Lindsay's book that she's mentioned. So I do very highly recommend this to those who are interested. And Rob, of your work, I happen to have this book, which contains one of your published papers. And so I'll recommend this to those who want additional resources as well. And I don't know for sure if your online bios list your other published works, but that's often a good place to find the works of scholars as well. So with that, I'm going to say Chimigwich to Lindsay and Rob. This has been such a rich and engaging discussion. I have an entire page of notes of other things I wanted to ask you about, but there wasn't time. So thank you so much for all of your insights and just a really fantastic talk. Miigwech.
Miigwech. On pourra prendre une pause. We can take a little break now, et on va tous se retrouver à 3 heures. So we can meet at 3 for the French language panel. Thank you, the 3 of you, very, very much. Miigwech.
Yes, thank you, everyone. That was fantastic. Donc bonjour, rebonjour ceux qui étaient présents lors de notre première séance. Donc là, on va continuer la conversation, mais en français. Pour ceux qui n'étaient pas présents dès le début, je m'appelle Kirsten Enke, je suis professeure à la faculté de droit à McGill. Au début, je me suis brièvement présentée en Ganingeha, langue Mohawk, et j'ai tenté de réciter une courte partie de Ohonda Gariwadekwa. C'est le discours d'ouverture Haudenosaunee qui salue et remercie la terre, les eaux, les plantes et les animaux, entre autres. Et mon introduction il a servi à nous situer sur un territoire autochtone et de faire quelques liens préliminaires entre la langue et le droit. Donc déjà, les protocoles qui nous demandent de s'adresser dans la langue du lieu. Deuxièmement, peut-être les relations qui sont constituées par la puissance ou la faiblesse de la position qu'on prend en parlant une langue ou une autre, donc notamment moi avec ma Mohawk de débutant. Et puis, troisièmement, peut-être la façon dont le droit est reflété dans la langue et vice-versa. Donc, l'interdépendance qui est au cœur de cette ouverture Mohawk et qui forme aussi une partie importante de la grammaire Ganyang-Geha, où il y a, comme j'ai appris, des douzaines de pronoms relationnels, et chaque fois qu'on veut construire un verbe, il faut penser à c'est qui le sujet, c'est qui l'objet, et puis construire le verbe à partir de là. Donc, et la conversation en anglais a aussi entamé une discussion sur les liens, la façon dont les langues sont construites et conçues, et les liens avec le droit. Donc là, ça me fait beaucoup de plaisir de vous présenter notre deux présentateurs. D'abord, on a la professeure Naomi Metalik, qui est membre de la Première Nation Listigouche, c'est une nation Mi'kmaq. Elle a pratiqué comme avocat, si je comprends bien, 10 ans avant de changer de cap, et elle est maintenant professeure adjointe et titulaire de la Chancellor's Chair in Aboriginal Law and Policy at the Schulich School of Law à l'université Dalhousie. Donc, bienvenue et merci beaucoup, Naomi. J'ai hâte de parler avec vous. Et deuxièmement, on a professeur Andrew John Fletcher, qui est d'origine de l'Écosse en fait, mais qui habite maintenant au Québec, et il est doctorant en histoire à l'université de Sherbrooke. Et son travail porte entre autres sur les dictionnaires produits par les jésuites à partir du XVIIe siècle, et j'espère qu'on va avoir l'occasion d'en parler aujourd'hui. Et il est aussi professeur d'histoire au collège Champlain à Lennoxville. Donc, merci beaucoup. Vous avez peut-être compris qu'on a préparé, on a posé des questions à l'avance aux participants. Donc, on va avoir un peu les mêmes questions, mais comme les gens sont différents et leur travail est différent, on va certainement avoir des conversations qui focalisent sur d'autres choses. Et d'abord, je voudrais inviter Naomi et Andrew juste de raconter un peu leur cheminement vers ou à travers les langues autochtones, ou une langue en particulier, bien sûr, et des traditions juridiques autochtones. Je vais demander à Naomi de commencer.
Merci beaucoup, Kristen. Bon, premièrement, je vais me présenter en Mi'kmaq parce que c'est la place pour faire, je pense aussi. Dalhousie Naomi Metalik dans Wedabexi Mi'kmaqi, Listigouche Dleawi, Garuwigiak Chibuktuk, Nucha Dalhousie Banach, Manny Metalik, Arkin Kitch Dalhousie Madeleine Morissette. Wildasi Begisin Giskuk. So, j'ai dit que je suis contente d'être ici, puis d'expliquer un peu de ma parenté, puis ainsi que où est-ce que je me situe dans le territoire des Mi'kmaq. Alors, oui, je vais donner un peu d'un survol de mon trajet à apprendre ma langue, puis aussi comment ça se relie à les ordres juridiques des Mi'kmaq aussi. Alors, mon père, Emmanuel Metalik, était un linguiste, un historien Mi'kmaq. Puis ma maman est québécoise qui vient de la Rédemption dans la vallée de Matapédia. Puis quand ils se sont rencontrés à Campbellton, elle ne parlait aucun anglais et lui ne parlait aucun français. Alors, mais ils se sont débrouillés. Ils se sont bien débrouillés. Puis au fil de temps, elle apprend l'anglais et ça devient la langue commune chez nous. Mais elle aussi nous parle français et mes parents, nous sommes enregistrés, moi et mes sœurs, dans une école immersion française. C'est pourquoi je vous parle en français aujourd'hui. Mais pour la langue Mi'kmaq, papa nous en parlait pas trop chez nous. À ce temps-là, c'était le pratique courant dans ma communauté que les personnes de l'âge de mon papa ne parlaient pas la langue à leurs enfants. La plupart de ces adultes étaient soit des survivants des pensionnats ou plutôt dans ma communauté, des survivants des externats indiens, des schools. Puis fort probable, à cause de cela, il avait des craintes par rapport à transmettre la langue à leurs enfants. Puis nous, on était envoyés à des écoles à Campbellton, au Nouveau-Brunswick, puis des écoles soit francophones ou anglophones. Alors, donc, je ne parlais pas couramment Mi'kmaq quand je suis devenue adulte. C'est la même chose pour mes sœurs. J'ai 2 sœurs, mais l'une d'entre elles, Jessica, a poursuivi des études dans le domaine de l'enseignement de langue et a mis un point d'honneur à apprendre de mon père, de ma grand-maman et d'autres membres de la famille et de la communauté la langue. Puis maintenant, elle enseigne dans la communauté aux adultes. Elle enseigne un programme d'immersion en Mi'kmaq. C'est vraiment quelque chose. Mais quant à moi, j'ai poursuivi une carrière en droit, travaillé dans le domaine du droit autochtone, c'est-à-dire le droit étatique par rapport au peuple autochtone, Section 35, la loi sur les Indiens, etc. Et même si je travaillais avec des communautés Mi'kmaq à Nouvelle-Écosse, au Nouveau-Brunswick, puis à d'autres parts, j'avais parfois l'impression de manquer quelque chose et j'aspirais à davantage d'occasions de m'engager dans ma culture et ma langue plus dans mon travail. Alors, en 2016, comme Christine avait dit, j'avais passé de la pratique privée au monde universitaire. Puis dès là, j'ai pris l'engagement d'en apprendre davantage et de donner un cours sur Indigenous Law. Ce que je veux dire sur cela, c'est le droit propre des peuples autochtones. Je sais qu'il n'y a pas vraiment un mot, on pourrait en parler plus, une terminologie exacte en français pour une distinction entre Aboriginal Law, le droit étatique canadien sur les Autochtones, puis le Indigenous Law, les droits propres communs des peuples autochtones. Mais c'est ça que je veux dire. Alors, je me suis dit, tu vas enseigner un cours. Puis, c'est ça. Puis, oui, le premier cours que j'ai commencé en 2016, le premier cours que j'ai offert, c'était en hiver 2019. Puis maintenant, ça fait 3 ans que j'enseigne le cours. Mais au commencement, j'avais seulement une petite connaissance de ce domaine. Mais grâce à la générosité de quelques collègues autochtones comme Val Napoleon, Hadley Friedland, puis d'autres qui ont partagé leurs matériaux. J'ai utilisé ça, puis j'ai lu davantage les livres de John Burroughs, puis les articles de plusieurs personnes sur le sujet. Je sais beaucoup plus maintenant que ça fait 3 ans passés, puis je me sens que je peux enseigner dans ce domaine. Puis c'est à cette époque que je me suis également engagée à apprendre la langue Mi'kmaq au sérieux. Comme j'avais des petits essais avant, mais cette fois-ci, c'était pour le sérieux. Puis je me dis, il y a sans doute un lien entre les deux, la langue puis la loi des Mi'kmaq. Et puis j'entends souvent les gens dire ça, les gens Mi'kmaq, que la loi est dans la langue. Alors, j'ai engagé ma sœur, Jessica, pour être mon professeur particulier. Puis elle est très, très bonne. Son approche est systématique et donne une base dans la grammaire. Puis les systèmes d'écriture de la langue. Puis c'est pas seulement la mémorisation, c'est vraiment une base de savoir comment la langue marche. Puis c'était aussi la méthode de mon père. Alors, je trouve que l'apprentissage a été si enrichissant pour moi à bien des égards. Ça m'a rapprochée avec ma sœur, Jessica, mais je me suis ressentie aussi un lien plus profond avec mon papa et mon grand-maman alors qu'ils sont décédés maintenant. Mais en travaillant avec la langue, puis beaucoup des outils que j'ai pour apprendre la langue que ma sœur utilise, c'est des outils des ressources que mon père a créées. Alors, il y a un dictionnaire Mi'kmaq qu'il avait écrit, ça s'appelle The Metallic Mi'kmaq English Dictionary. J'utilise ça davantage. Aussi, ma sœur a préparé plusieurs ressources. Un de mes ressources plus utilisées, c'est un Mi'kmaq, c'est Mi'kmaq Way de l'Estudie 01. C'est un livre de commencement pour des beginners, mais ça marche très bien. Puis, oui, c'est ça. Mon père nous a laissé des incroyables ressources, comme j'ai dit. Puis, ma sœur a aussi produit des ressources pédagogiques fantastiques. Oui, à ce point-ci, 3 ans en allant, je ne suis pas totalement couramment parleur dans ma langue, mais je sais bien beaucoup plus qu'avant. Et je comprends beaucoup plus par rapport à comment la langue marche et la grammaire de la langue. Aussi, j'en parlerai plus peut-être après, la vision du monde du Mi'kmaq par la langue, parce que ça nous enseigne beaucoup. C'est alors avec ces nouvelles connaissances de ma langue, mais aussi dans les méthodologies émergentes dans les domaines des droits des peuples autochtones, en Indigenous Law, des nouvelles méthodologies, que j'ai rédigé 2 articles l'année dernière par rapport à les méthodologies linguistiques qu'on peut utiliser pour revitaliser les lois des peuples autochtones. Alors, je propose 5, mais je pense que je vais arrêter là pour le moment, puis peut-être je pourrai en parler davantage après que Andrew se présente et son trajet. Merci.
Merci Naomi. On va sûrement reprendre ces thèmes-là. Et maintenant Andrew, merci.
Encore quoi? Bonjour. Je suis enfin un immigrant écossais, comme vous disiez tantôt. Donc, j'ai grandi en Écosse, puis autour de 20 ans, j'ai décidé de venir au Canada. Donc, j'ai une vision un peu différente des autres gens qui ont intervenu aujourd'hui. Je ne suis pas un avocat, je suis un historien, donc je viens de notre perspective dans ce qui m'intéresse dans la question de loi autochtone. Puis aussi, je ne suis ni autochtone moi-même, ni enfin, je n'étais pas né canadienne, je suis devenu un. Donc, j'ai eu une formation en histoire en Écosse, à l'Université de Glasgow. Puis, quand j'ai émigré, j'ai commencé à enseigner maintenant 15 ans au cégep ici à Lennoxville, où on doit dire Nicatagouaxis, le petit forge dans la rivière, qui est le nom abénaquise du Lennoxville. Et enfin, moi, j'ai entrepris il y a maintenant 2 ans et demi à apprendre l'abénaquis, donc qui est la langue de cette région, la langue initiale de cette région, qui enfin, on parle de façon coloniale de les cantons de l'Est, ou Estrie, mais le territoire abénaquis est encore beaucoup plus grand que ça, qui traverse la frontière canadien-américain. La raison qui m'a amené à étudier l'abénaquis, c'est parce que j'avais commencé des études, un doctorat en histoire dans les relations légales, enfin, en Nouvelle-France, entre l'Empire français et les sociétés autochtones. Ce qui m'a amené à cette question particulière, c'est que depuis plusieurs années, j'avais donné un cours de criminologie, l'histoire de criminologie, enfin de crime et punissement, qui avait c'était très occidental comme approche. Et j'ai voulu aller chercher des connaissances sur les lois des autochtones dans l'histoire. Surtout ici à Lennoxville, on a quand même plusieurs étudiants autochtones. Donc, j'ai commencé à fouiller pour voir ce qui est écrit sur l'histoire des systèmes légaux autochtones au Canada. Et j'ai trouvé que oui, il y avait certaines choses, mais il n'y avait pas beaucoup d'études qui étaient ni récentes, ni en profondeur. Les historiens, on a la tendance à parler, quand on regarde les peuples autochtones, dans le période de Nouvelle-France, de faire des grands traits, de traiter toutes les nations très diverses comme étant une seule peuple, une seule façon de voir la loi. Puis, c'est pas très fort méthodologiquement. Alors, j'ai commencé à fouiller ce sujet. J'ai tombé en fait sur des cas très intéressants qui ont lieu en fait dans le pays des Illinois, ce qui est enfin correspond plus ou moins avec l'Illinois, l'État d'Illinois. Et en faisant ça, j'ai aussi trouvé des ressources, des dictionnaires écrits par les jésuites en français, bien sûr, latin aussi, et la langue miami-illinoise. Qui donne une nouvelle perspective aux questions légales, qui sort un peu des archives écrites par soit des prêtres ou des officiers coloniaux. Et bon, j'avais besoin d'aller chercher une formation en une langue algonquienne. Et c'est arrivé qu'au même temps, l'Université de Sherbrooke commençait à donner des cours d'Abenakis pour la première fois. Puis, c'est comme ça que je me suis commencé mon parcours dans la langue Abenakis. Je pense que je vais arrêter là pour le moment, mais ça donne un petit topo.
Donc, à moins que je me trompe, il y a quelqu'un dans notre public qui parle déjà les langues dont vous parlez, Mi'kmaq et Abenaki. Je pense que ce serait utile de partager avec nous des particularités de ces langues parce que si on ne sait pas, on peut juste présumer que c'est juste une question de vocabulaire qui est différent, etc. Mais notre première conversation, en fait, avec Rob Clifford et Lindsay Burrows a été très éclaircissant. Ils ont parlé, par exemple, de la caractéristique de la langue Anishinaabe qui fait beaucoup avec les verbes, on va dire. C'est vraiment centré sur les verbes, même les noms sont construits comme des verbes. Et aussi, si je peux parler, les deux ont parlé du côté très imagistique. Donc, la langue, c'est très pictoral, il y a beaucoup de descriptions dans les mots. Et des fois, les sons même qui sont plus onomatopéiques, qui comme empruntent leur son de la nature. Donc, juste pour donner un ordre d'idée de notre conversation, je sais que Naomi n'a pas eu de présent pour la première session. Est-ce qu'il y a des choses, des façons de décrire les langues que vous êtes en train d'apprendre pour ceux qui n'ont aucune expérience avec ces langues-là?
Bon, oui, il y a des similarités. En Mi'kmaq, la langue est aussi vraiment ancrée sur les verbes. Il y a 60% de la langue est verbe. Nos couleurs sont des verbes. Nos numéros sont des verbes. Tout est verbe. Beaucoup est verbe. Puis, en fait, les méthodologies, je pourrais venir plutôt sur les méthodologies que j'ai déterminées, mais ça figure beaucoup sur les aspects du langue pour nous dire beaucoup du pensée, du vision du monde des Mi'kmaq. Je pourrais en parler plus après, mais juste pour donner Je pense un que tu n'as pas mentionné encore, mais qui est très important chez beaucoup des langues autochtones, c'est le fait qu'ils sont une grande différence entre les langues autochtones et européennes. En général, c'est le fait que beaucoup de langues autochtones sont polysynthétiques, puis ça veut dire que les mots sont construits à partir des unités plus petites, des petites parties de mots, puis ils fonctionnent de la même manière, je pourrais dire comme des blocs de Lego. Ils ont des formes et des significations différentes et ils sont assemblés en mots selon des règles spécifiques. Mais il y a beaucoup qu'on peut percevoir de cela, d'utilisation des plus petits mots. Ça figure dans une de mes méthodes. Peut-être un autre avant de donner la part à mon collègue. Ça sera de dire aussi d'autres importants aspects de la langue mi'kmaq que je sais que d'autres langues algonquines, mais d'autres aussi. C'est en effet pour excuse-moi pour une seconde, je regarde pour ma place ici. Animation et inanimation, c'est le méthode prédominant pour les genres. Tu sais, en français, c'est masculin, féminin. Anglais aussi, c'est masculin, féminin. Il n'y a pas de pronoms en mi'kmaq qui sont masculins ni féminins. Ça, c'est une importante chose. Mais un autre aspect, pas un aspect, un différent aspect, mais il est très important chez les mi'kmaq aussi, c'est l'animation et non-inanimation. Inanimate or inanimate. C'est une classe qu'on met presque tout dans ces deux catégories, ou c'est une très grande catégorie dans la conjugation des verbes, puis tout aspect. Alors, puis même la singulière, pluriel, tout dépend sur si on classe quelque chose comme inanima ou anima. Si c'est en vie ou si c'est pas en vie. Puis alors, puis il y a bien plus de choses que les mi'kmaq pensent sont en vie que les cultures européennes, comme les montagnes, les roches, certains ruisseaux, puis ça peut changer aussi, même des objets. Ça dépend aussi, ça peut même changer des fois si c'est anima ou pas inanima. Puis ça, c'est fascinant. Alors, ça, c'est trois petites choses. Il y a bien plus, mais juste pour donner un petit goût de certaines différences.
Merci. Juste pour situer la langue mi'kmaq, et je pense que je suis correcte en disant ça, mais la première session, Lindsay Burrows nous avait parlé de la famille algonquienne de langues, donc Anishinaabe, ça en fait partie, mais aussi, je pense, mi'kmaq, ça fait partie donc il y a certainement, même moi, avec mon niveau de tout débutant, je peux reconnaître des mots pour chef, pour des mots pour terre, sont un peu similaires. Donc, juste pour situer ces langues. Et Andrew, Abenaki, est-ce que ça en fait partie de la famille algonquienne aussi?
Oui, enfin, donc ce que Naomi vient de dire, c'est vrai aussi pour l'Abenaki et aussi le Miami illinois. Lindsay Burrows a parlé de la grande étendue de cette langue qui part de l'Atlantique jusqu'au je pense Colombie-Britannique, puis sur les grandes plaines, c'est parlé. Donc, Miami illinois, c'est très différent de l'Abenaki, surtout quand on regarde la langue comme c'était parlé au début du 18e siècle. Mais il y a des mots qu'on retrouve. Le mot pour noix, c'est pakana. Puis, c'est vraisemblablement le mot en Abenaki et en Illinois. Puis, enfin, ça vient le mot en Pekin. Ça vient de cette langue qu'on utilise pour le couronnement. Moi, je trouve que c'est très différent des langues indo-européennes. Ça prend beaucoup plus de temps d'apprendre. Ce que j'ai appris, c'est pour faire le même niveau d'enseignement. Si en tant que francophone, ou quelqu'un qui parle bien français, on prend un cours d'espagnol, ça nous prend une session. on va arriver à un niveau. Pour apprendre la vernacular, ça va prendre 4 sessions pour avoir le même niveau que si on avait fait une cours d'espagnol. Donc, ça prend du temps, c'est parce que c'est la construction des mots différents, le côté verbal, ça prend beaucoup de temps à apprendre. Mais je trouve, pour moi, la chose la plus frappante quand j'ai commencé à apprendre la vernacular, c'est la beauté de la langue. Le fait que c'est polysynthétique et qu'il y a des morphèmes qui construisent des mots, ça donne une beauté qu'on trouve très rarement en anglais ou français. Un des mots préférés que j'ai appris, c'est le mot pour hirondelle, qui saute dans la 6, qui peut être traduit comme petit oiseau de pluie. Puis ça, c'est un côté qui est vraiment frappant quand on commence à apprendre ces langues.
Je vais juste faire suivi parce que si Andrew va donner son mot préféré, je vais donner un qui me fait rire parce que je parlais. C'est vrai que c'est Mi'kmaq puis les autres langues algonquins sont très descriptifs, mais un de mes mots favoris en Mi'kmaq, c'est le mot pour vache, qui veut dire littéralement orignal français. Le mot, c'est Wenji Diam. Wenji, Wenouch, ça veut dire quelqu'un français ou quelque chose qui est de français. Puis Diam, c'est le mot pour un orignal. Alors, c'est un orignal français, le vache.
Parfait. Alors, je vais faire le segue vers le lien entre le langage, la langue et le droit. On a déjà discuté longuement de ces liens-là lors de la première session. Moi, juste pour partager avec vous, je fais un exercice avec mes étudiants de première année quand on introduit l'idée d'une langue qui soit centrée sur les verbes, et puis on fait la réflexion de l'importance des noms dans le droit étatique ou le droit d'origine européen, et qu'on est toujours en train de chercher des catégories, de faire des distinctions entre les noms qui sont comme des choses qui sont solides, qui bougent pas. Et puis, je leur donne un exercice, réécris un texte de droit, ça peut être de la Constitution, du Code civil, n'importe quoi, réécris-le sans nom. Remplacez tous les noms par verbe et vous voyez ce que... Donc, c'est un exercice de comme exploser la tête un petit peu, et ça nous montre à quel point notre droit dépend sur les noms et sur l'idée de pouvoir comme fixer la réalité dans des catégories. Donc juste pour lancer la conversation, est-ce que vous avez des réflexions, le lien entre la langue et le droit, est-ce que c'est similaire pour les langues et le droit européen et pour les langues et les droits, le droit autochtone, ou est-ce que le rapport peut être un peu différent?
J'irais, puis maintenant, je pourrais peut-être parler un petit peu de les 5 méthodes que j'ai identifiées. Peut-être je ne vais pas en parler, donner plus de détails, mais peut-être il y aurait des questions après. Mais quand j'ai commencé à travailler avec les différentes méthodologies comme Hadley Friedland puis Val Napoleon, ils ont leur méthodologie pour travailler avec les histoires publiées, pour susciter des principes ou des valeurs qui viennent. Puis alors, les méthodologies que je propose, c'est d'une manière semblable. Alors, c'est pour susciter soit les valeurs ou les principes de la langue, afin que les communautés peuvent en tourne informer le développement de leur loi avec ces principes et ces valeurs. Puis, je me base sur Ghislain Otis, il y a une belle... ils disent que chaque ordre juridique a comme 5 choses en commun. C'est des valeurs, des principes, des règles, des procès, puis des personnes. Alors, j'essaie de démontrer à mes étudiants que la loi étatique, a les valeurs puis les principes là-dedans. Juste pour faire le lien que it's everywhere, c'est tout, tout part. Alors, en tout cas, c'est mon premier point. Puis, il y a, d'après moi, au moins 5 méthodologies pour voir, pour susciter ces valeurs de la langue et principes de la langue. Alors, ben, la première, je dirais, c'est utiliser un mot autochtone pour décrire un grand principe, un meta-principle, un principe méta. Puis ça, c'est assez commun comme à des systèmes de droit étatique. Au Canada, le principe d'égalité. C'est un grand principe que tout le monde a le droit à l'égalité, mais il faut que ça soit interprété. Mais il y a bien des mots dans les mots autochtones, dans la langue autochtone, qui expriment un concept normatif qui peut s'appliquer à une variété de situations. Puis c'est la méthodologie à ce point-ci qui est le plus utilisée avec les langues autochtones. J'ai un deuxième article qui donne 5 ou 6 exemples de différentes communautés et différentes lois qui utilisent cette méthode. Alors, de prendre un concept dans une langue autochtone pourrait être un grand principe normatif. En Mi'kmaq, un grand qui est utilisé dans mon coin, c'est le concept Nedugalimk. Qui, en effet, transmet un concept d'utilisation des terres, de gestion de ressources et de redistribution des ressources. Puis il y a aussi des liens spirituels puis gouvernementaux là-dedans. Mais c'est utilisé de plus en plus. Même il y a une loi à Nouvelle-Écosse qui utilise le concept de Nedugalimk. C'est le Sustainable Development Act. Puis c'est dit en utilisant cette loi, il faut que les fonctionnaires prennent en compte le concept de Nedugalimk. Puis il y a aussi des groupes autochtones qui utilisent cette méthode aussi. Une loi de ma propre chez nous, de l'Estigouche, il y a une loi qui ont passé 2 ans passés sur la gestion d'homard. Puis il y a une section qui dit guide de principes de base. Puis ces principes doivent être utilisés pour interpréter toute la loi. Puis il y a comme 5 ou 6 principes Mi'kmaq là-dedans. Ouais, c'est ça. Il donne le mot, puis après ça, en Mi'kmaq, mais après ça, il donne une définition en anglais dans la loi, puis il donne des exemples de comment utiliser la loi. En tout cas, c'est une méthode, mais c'est pas la seule. Il y en a d'autres. Puis je vais juste brièvement essayer de dire les autres, puis je pourrais en fait donner d'autres explications. Mais c'est ma deuxième méthode que je décris dans mon article, c'est d'utiliser la grammaire comme révélation de vision du monde. Puis vous avez déjà parlé de ça, comme toutes les choses avec les verbes, d'avoir des langues qui sont plus basées en verbes. Ça démontre beaucoup. Ça démontre que les Européens sont plus basés sur des noms, comme Christine avait dit. Mais chez les Mi'kmaq, ça veut dire que notre vision du monde, c'est comme un univers qui est toujours en processus, toujours en constante évolution et dynamique. Puis, en plus de ça, je parle un peu dans mon article que cela reflète notre façon de voir le monde, que les circonstances peuvent changer, les gens peuvent changer. Même nos histoires publiées, ils ont des messages comme celle. Alors, on peut voir des liens entre nos histoires puis la langue. Mais nos histoires, comme de méthodologie, ça nous démontre qu'il n'y a pas vraiment dans des histoires Mi'kmaq des gens qui sont toujours des vilains. Quelqu'un peut toujours changer, puis les effets pourront toujours changer. Alors, je dis que même cette idée de toujours le monde être en constante évolution et dynamique peut aussi soutenir des valeurs comme de réhabilitation, aussi la rédemption, comme important chez les Mi'kmaq. Alors, on peut voir comment ces valeurs sont imbuées dans la langue. Puis, on peut supporter ça avec d'autres lois qui viennent de nos histoires. Alors, on peut voir que c'est là dans la langue. Une autre méthode que j'en parle, c'est la méthode d'utiliser les parties de mots, que nos langues sont polysynthétiques, puis en effet, étudier et analyser les parties de mots pour voir qu'est-ce que ça nous dit, comment est-ce qu'on pense du monde, toutes sortes de choses comme ça. Puis l'exemple que je donne dans mon article, il y a une partie de mots en Mi'kmaq, c'est O puis Q, un long O. Puis quand on met ça sur un mot, comme le mot pour fleur, puis on met un O là-dessus, ça veut dire que c'est une vase pour un fleur. C'est un contenant. N'importe quoi, on met un O dessus, ça devient un contenant pour la chose. Puis des fois, quand on décrit quelqu'un qui est décédé, on met un O sur le fin de leur nom. Alors, c'est comme décrire que leur esprit est plus là, puis leur corps est plutôt un contenant pour cet esprit. En tout cas, il y a des liens là, puis une analyse on pourrait faire sur la réincarnation chez les Mi'kmaq, puis nos valeurs sur cela. Deux autres, je vais juste dire plus brièvement. La quatrième méthode que je regarde, c'est de garder un groupe de mots ensemble, d'apporter un groupe de mots ensemble, puis analyser pour déceler les similitudes ou les différences ou la façon dont ils sont utilisés par les locuteurs d'une langue, afin de relever les caractéristiques d'un concept ou d'une vision du monde. Alors, il y a du monde qui ont apporté un groupe de mots ensemble en Mi'kmaq pour les mots de justice. Puis quand on regarde ces mots, ils sont différents des concepts européens de justice. Nous, sur un projet qu'on avait fait sur le concept de Nedugalim, que j'ai parlé tantôt, on a gardé dans des dictionnaires Mi'kmaq tous des mots sur le partage. Il y avait comme une vingtaine, trentaine de mots juste sur le concept de partager. Puis, ça nous donne comme vraiment une vision de comment les Mi'kmaq voient le concept de partager avec du monde. Même le mot pour chef, en Mi'kmaq, ça veut dire celui qui, son obligation, c'est de faire sûr que tout est partagé d'une manière égale entre le monde. Alors, c'est vraiment fascinant de regarder des groupes de mots ensemble. Puis, on peut voir les valeurs, des principes qui sont là-dedans. Puis, dernière méthode, excuse-moi Christine pour aller long, mais j'aime bien parler de tout ça. C'est des noms de places. Les Autochtones ont vraiment des différentes pratiques de nommer nos lieux que des pratiques européennes. Il y a on a comme une dizaine de différentes manières de nommer des places. Puis c'est assez différent des pratiques européennes. Puis oui, les noms de places, ça peut raconter les caractéristiques du paysage, très descriptif, mais ça peut aussi nous dire quelles ressources étaient importantes au Mi'kmaq dans ce lieu, ou la façon dont le site était utilisé, ou soit ça peut dire une histoire des événements historiques qui ont arrivé là, ou même ça peut être nommé par rapport à des mythes ou personnes mythologiques des Mi'kmaq. Alors, puis avec ça aussi, on peut retrouver beaucoup de comment les Mi'kmaq voyaient leur territoire, leur espace. Alors, oui, c'est ça que je voulais dire, qu'il y a vraiment très intéressantes manières qu'on peut regarder les langues autochtones pour voir beaucoup. Merci.
Je vais juste mentionner, parce que l'article dont vous faites référence est pas encore publié, mais on va donner les détails. Enfin, ça va être dans le McGill Law Journal. Oui, c'est ça. Ce que vous avez raconté sur les mots, sur le partage, ça me fait penser au témoignage d'un aîné Mi'kmaq lors des procès Bernard et Marshall, donc des arrêts qui sont allés jusqu'à la Cour suprême. Et puis, c'est tourné autour du concept de propriété de droit territorial qui était revendiqué en termes de défense dans cet arrêt-là, mais le titre ancestral. Et Captain Augustine insistait sur le fait que le concept de propriété chez les Mi'kmaq, c'était axé sur le partage. Alors que le test pour le titre autochtone, c'est un des critères, c'est qu'il faut prouver historiquement une occupation exclusive. Alors, comment réconcilier l'idée de partage avec l'idée d'exclusivité? Ça fitait pas, et même le juge, je pense que c'était le juge McLaughlin à la fin, la décision ne tournait pas autour de cette question-là, mais elle a dit que peut-être c'était incompatible avec l'idée de titre ancestral. Donc, moi, je trouvais ça très, très intéressant. Et peut-être juste, j'ai envie de partager un peu de contexte pour notre public, parce qu'il y en a qui sont peut-être pas au courant, mais quand vous avez peut-être eu l'impression à travers nos discussions qu'on cherche beaucoup des méthodologies et des outils pour pouvoir parler du droit autochtone. Donc, ça fait partie d'un processus de revitalisation qui dure pendant plusieurs décennies maintenant, mais qui était donné un peu de coup de pouce par le rapport de excuse-moi, d'habitude je parle de ces choses en anglais, là je traduis comme
Vérité et réconciliation.
Merci, le terme ne venait pas tout de suite. Donc, un de leurs appels à action, c'était que les écoles de droit devraient enseigner un sujet obligatoire sur le droit étatique, sur les autochtones, sur les traités, sur le droit international, mais aussi sur le droit propre des autochtones, donc ce qu'on appelle Indigenous Legal Traditions ou traditions juridiques autochtones. Et donc, mais comment le faire au sein d'une école de droit, d'une université, quand normalement ce serait appris en communauté, en territoire, avec les aînés et tout. Donc, on cherche et puis, pas juste pour l'enseignement, mais aussi il y a des communautés qui cherchent à pouvoir rédiger les lois contemporaines sur les enfants, sur l'environnement, sur tout ce genre de choses. Donc, ils cherchent à un peu moderniser ou pouvoir s'appuyer sur le droit traditionnel pour développer un droit moderne. Donc, on cherche beaucoup des outils. Et ce que nous a présenté Naomi, sa propre contribution à ce travail-là, c'est de chercher de développer des méthodes basées sur la langue, de pouvoir articuler, trouver le droit, parce que ça peut, qu'on trouve dans la langue, dans les récits, dans la terre. Donc, il y a une belle contribution que vous faites là, Naomi. Merci. Et donc, Andrew, je sais que vous avez déjà expliqué que vous n'êtes pas dans le même contexte juridique, donc vous avez écrit un peu aussi sur la revitalisation, mais vos préoccupations avec le droit autochtone étaient un peu différentes que les nôtres peut-être au sein des facs de droit. Donc, vous avez déjà parlé du fait d'avoir enseigné des cours sur la criminologie, d'avoir essayé d'élargir un peu le lentille à travers la lentille qu'on utilise pour apprendre des choses comme ça. Donc, je lance la même question pour vous, la connexion entre la langue et le droit, selon vous.
Merci. C'est très intéressant le travail que Naomi a fait sur les dictionnaires. Et je dirais que ce que on parle ici, c'est de revitalisation, puis prendre la langue, puis revitaliser la loi, la question de droit aussi. Là, moi, je fais un peu l'inverse. Je prends des dictionnaires pour aller essayer de trouver c'était quoi la loi, particulièrement des Illinois, il y a 300 ans. Mais ce que je trouve fascinant, c'est que les mêmes techniques peuvent être utilisées, c'est de regarder les grands concepts. Puis là, il y a des grands concepts, utiliser des morphèmes, des parties de mots qu'on trouve dans les dictionnaires qui ont enregistré des mots autochtones il y a 300 ans. Il faut dire que c'est des sources qui sont colonialistes, c'est les sources les dictionnaires étaient faits pour l'évangélisation, mais c'est aussi des sources avec une contribution autochtone, parce qu'on ne peut pas faire un dictionnaire sans interlocuteur. Et l'autre chose qui est très intéressant d'un point de vue historique, c'est que c'est des dictionnaires qui étaient créés comme outil pour des jésuites qui travaillaient sur le terrain. Donc, ils ne se gênaient pas de mettre tous les mots qu'ils voudraient. Si quelque chose qu'ils trouvaient était un peu risqué, ils l'écrivaient simplement en latin. Donc, c'est des choses très riches. Là, pour la question de langue et la loi ou du droit, on a comme deux choses que j'aimerais souligner. Une, c'est que la langue et le droit est dynamique. Ça change avec le temps. Mais aussi, on peut voir une continuité dans la langue et dans le droit. Il y a une relation entre ce changement, ce dynamisme et cette continuité qu'il faut creuser. C'est un des problèmes que je ne suis pas juriste, mais un des problèmes que j'ai compris qui existait autour des questions de loi et des communautés autochtones, c'est la question des juges qui jouent à l'historien. Et OK, moi, je ne veux pas me jouer au juriste, mais je trouve que souvent l'histoire est malmenée dans les cours. Puis il manque des fois la compréhension que des choses vont changer avec le temps et ça reste complètement légitime. Juste comme la langue reste la même langue, même s'il y a des mots qui rentrent. Donc, ça, c'est une chose. L'autre, c'est une question de parole et traduction. Pour regarder une des grandes principes qu'on peut utiliser les dictionnaires jésuites de Miami, Illinois, on voit que le mot qu'ils ont choisi pour décrire la loi, c'est Kikintonoragan. Puis ça comme c'est traduit, c'est parole, observance et loi. Donc, on voit que dans la langue Miami-Illinois et dans l'interprétation que les jésuites ont fait, c'est qu'il y a un lien très fort entre la parole et la loi. Mais aussi, là, dans ça, il y a observance. Ils ont utilisé le même mot pour parler du Saint-Sacrement. Donc, c'est un mot qui cherchait à trouver un mot pour décrire une notion très abstraite du Saint-Sacrement en christianisme. Puis ils ont choisi le même mot qu'ils ont traduit comme loi. Donc on peut voir dans ces grandes idées une idée de sacré qui est dans la loi, qu'on trouve aussi dans les autres sources qu'on peut regarder. Il y a une très intéressante où un Français, un maître de marchandises, une commis dans le fort de Chartres en Illinois, a tué un autre Français, un soldat, un tambour, lors d'un argument autour d'une mise au vente en chair. La question elle-même, c'est intriguant d'un côté histoire légale de la Nouvelle-France. Mais ce qu'on a aussi dans les archives, c'est des discours que des chefs Cahokia et Cahokia ont venu faire pour défendre le français en disant c'est parce qu'il risquait d'être pendu. Et il disait non, c'est pas comme ça qu'on fait la loi ici. Je paraphrase, mais il imposait leur façon de voir la résolution de conflits, de meurtre sur les Français. Et là, on a dit, c'est un des rapports très intéressants, c'est écrit en français, traduit donc premièrement de Miami-Illinois en français, et avec tous les problèmes qu'on peut avoir avec la traduction, mais ça reste des discours où on peut entendre vraiment les paroles, la philosophie enfin de la justice autochtone à cette période. Puis là, on voit toute la cérémonie du calumet, le tabac et comment il approche les officiers français qui constituent le corps. On peut entendre aussi, au travers de la traduction, le rythme du discours. Puis, bien qu'on ne peut pas, moi, je n'ai certainement pas la capacité d'essayer de faire une traduction à l'envers, on peut entendre les rythmes de la langue. Et les officiers français, lui, eux, ils connaissaient quand même assez bien les costumes. Voilà, ça reste que c'est une question de conflit, une question de fierté aussi française qui ne veut pas immédiatement accéder aux demandes de leur interlocuteur. Mais le résultat, c'est qu'un an plus tard, M. Perriot a un brevet de rémission qui arrive de Versailles, enfin. Donc, c'est un des cas, il y a plusieurs cas comme ça, mais c'est celui qui est le meilleur documenté, où on peut voir les questions de loi étant, c'est une discussion le problème qu'on a comme historien, et c'est de traduire ces concepts-là en français ou en anglais et voir qu'est-ce qu'on va perdre dans ce moment de traduction. Mais on peut voir des principes comment on dit, de l'époque, il utilisait l'idée de couvrir le mot. Donc, l'idée, ce n'était pas de trouver la vengeance, c'est le mot qu'ils ont utilisé, de tuer quelqu'un. C'est une question de vengeance, mais plutôt de trouver une façon de couvrir le mot. Donc, soit une partie, une famille donner des choses, des biens, mais aussi des biens qui étaient, c'est pas monétaire comme échange nécessairement, c'était des choses spirituelles, de démontrer la tristesse au mort et aussi de nettoyer le tache, enfin, c'est le mot qui est utilisé en français, des tachetés de sang. Le mot pour meurtre en illinois, un des mots c'est qui est utilisé, c'est de tacher le chemin avec du sang, donc c'est-à-dire d'une pollution qui est faite sur le chemin droit qu'on doit suivre. Donc, on peut, en utilisant les dictionnaires et des sources existantes, on peut avoir une meilleure idée, une meilleure perspective de ce qui était la philosophie légale autochtone. Puis que c'est quelque chose qu'on peut aussi pousser plus loin parce que moi, mon niveau de illinois, c'est extrêmement limité. Je comprends, en apprenant l'Abenaki, je comprends la fonction des mots, mais d'autres académiques, d'autres qui parlent mieux les langues peuvent pousser cette réflexion plus profondément et en révélant, en utilisant les langues, ils peuvent révéler des choses aussi qui sont à ce moment cachées dans les archives.
Super intéressant. Donc, j'ai une dernière question sur la revitalisation, mais et après ça, je vais passer, je vais inviter notre public à poser des questions, soit dans le chat, soit en levant la main avec l'icône. Et on avait déjà parlé dans la première session un peu de la revitalisation ici aussi, mais avec vous deux, il y a comme une expertise particulière. De Andrew surtout sur les productions historiques des langues et on peut dire aussi des lois ou du droit. Et c'est un peu ironique que des fois c'est les agents du colonialisme qui ont produit des matériaux qui maintenant sont très très importants dans les mouvements de revitalisation, pour certains, je sais que pour mes amis Haudenosaunee, ils dépendent beaucoup sur les travaux des ethnologues et tout d'il y a 100 ans. Et donc j'imagine, on a un petit peu parlé de ça avant de venir ici, mais le conflit qu'il peut y avoir en devoir se reposant sur ce genre de texte historique écrit par les jésuites ou d'autres agents de la colonisation. Est-ce que, Naomi, est-ce que dans votre cas, je sais que votre père a écrit un dictionnaire, mais c'est quoi, quels sont les matériaux historiques qui sont importants pour apprendre la langue Mi'kmaq aujourd'hui?
Oui, ben, il y a aussi tellement de ressources. Il y en a qui sont plus vieux, comme les écritures des jésuites, où il y a plusieurs dictionnaires qui ont été écrits, des places de noms qui étaient écrits par des prêtres. Père Pacifique, c'est un gros dans notre coin, aussi Silas Rand, c'est un autre. Puis c'est vrai qu'il y a toujours des risques en utilisant ces ressources, mais en même temps, ce sont des ressources assez riches. Puis il y a 2 articles que mon papa il écrivait aussi. Puis il y a un beau article où est-ce qu'il dit il perd des risques. Tu sais, ils disent que quand les jésuites décrivaient les circonstances ici ici, tu sais, ils écrivaient chez eux, puis ils décrivaient dans des manières assez barbariques, tout ça. Mais ils disaient il disait ça parce qu'il voulait de l'argent. Tu sais, quelqu'un payait pour ça. Alors, je vais le lire parce que c'est beau puis c'est en anglais, mais c'est bref. Mais there's another unfortunate aspect about all missionary activity. Someone was funding it. The trick was to write home to old France and describe how deplorable the conditions were here, and more monies would be on their way to New France. C'était mon papa qui a écrit ça. Mais aussi, il écrit un autre article où est-ce qu'ils disent une appréciation pour les jésuites qui ont écrit ça, parce que sans ça, on n'aurait pas ces ressources riches. Aussi, il remercie ses ancêtres qui ont pris la patience pour donner l'information. Tu sais, nos ancêtres étaient dans ce processus aussi, comme Andrew avait dit tantôt. Puis, il y a des manières pour faire sûr que ces vieux ressources, on enlève le bias de cela en leur travaillant avec ça. Comme mon père, qu'est-ce qu'il faisait avec des vieilles histoires? Il prenait ça, il réécrit en Mi'kmaq l'histoire. Puis après ça, comme a mis ça plus dans... Alors, il prend les vieilles histoires, il le remet, il recrée en Mi'kmaq, puis après ça, il travaillait avec cela. Alors, il y a des manières, tu peux rapporter toutes ces histoires ou ces langues avant des ancêtres, des parleurs de la langue, puisqu'on pourrait discuter c'est quoi les problèmes avec la manière que ça a été interprété par des jésuites ou des prêtres avant.
Parfait. Andrew, est-ce que vous avez d'autres réflexions aussi sur la façon dont ces dictionnaires historiques sont utilisés aujourd'hui?
Oui, ouais, sont très importants, bien qu'il y ait des limitations. Pour l'Abenaki, là, c'est une langue vivante encore, mais dans le nombre de gens qui parlent couramment est très rapidement baissé depuis les années 50. Le dernier mot, enfin, qui est rentré dans la langue comme naturellement, c'est Sputnik pour un satellite. Donc, depuis ce temps-là, il s'est parlé, mais ça a besoin vraiment de revitalisation. Puis, une des choses, je suis impliqué enfin ici avec l'Université Bishops, l'Université Sherbrooke, Una College, puis Ordinac, dans un projet de centre de documentation des langues autochtones qui s'appelle Awikigani-Saskak, qui veut dire enfin le livre, tablette de livre. Bookshelf. Anyway, mais ça, c'est une des choses qu'ils font, c'est qu'ils utilisent l'intelligence artificielle, des programmes pour transcrire des manuscrits qui sont écrits par des jésuites. Parce qu'il y a beaucoup de nuances, des mots qu'on en est en train de perdre à ce moment-là, qu'on peut quand même retrouver dans ces ressources. Jusqu'à un tel point que la langue illinois, les derniers gens qui parlaient cette langue comme langue première sont morts il y a à peu près 70 ans. Donc, pendant une période d'à peu près 40-50 ans, c'était une langue officiellement morte. Mais il y avait tellement de ressources écrites par les jésuites que la langue était capable, aussi en utilisant d'autres langues de la même famille algonquienne, ils étaient capables de le réutiliser. Et enfin, moi, j'utilise ces dictionnaires. Les historiens, on est en train tranquillement de comprendre la valeur de ces sources-là, mais ça fait plus que 30 ans que les linguistes travaillent avec des Peoria et des Miamia pour l'utiliser pour redonner une vie à cette langue. Donc, il y a, comme on disait tantôt, la réutilisation de langue, et c'est aussi lié, comme Naomi travaille sur la réutilisation des lois. Les deux sont intimement liés.
Super, merci. Donc, je vais ouvrir la parole aux participants. J'espère que vous avez gardé des questions après la première session. Surtout si vous voulez les poser en français, mais je suis sûre qu'en anglais, ça serait bienvenu aussi. Bon, merci Sandy. Donc la question c'est, croyez-vous que le système judiciaire au Canada devrait subir un changement profond pour incorporer des réalités autochtones, puisque une est beaucoup plus fluide que l'autre et pour honorer des systèmes judiciaires qui étaient ici depuis bien longtemps avant la colonisation?
Oui, c'est une discussion qui est grand puis qui continue. Puis je dirais d'un bord, je pense que comme aux États-Unis, les groupes autochtones ici aimeraient avoir plutôt même leurs propres tribunaux aussi, mais doivent toujours avoir des questions puis l'interface entre le droit étatique, mais de plus en plus des droits autochtones. Puis oui, il y aura besoin d'un grand changement profond pour incorporer. Mais il y a des juges qui commencent à voir la lumière un petit peu. Il y en a, il y a un couple d'articles que j'aime référer aux juges. Il y avait un de Monsieur le juge Bish de la Cour Colombie-Britannique qui avait écrit par rapport à une obligation de duty to learn, obligation de savoir. Puis même plus récemment, un autre juge de la Cour de Colombie-Britannique qui a dit il n'y a pas juste un duty to learn, mais il y a un duty to act. Puis même Madame le juge en chef McLaughlin avant avait dit quelque chose dans un colloque, avait dit la même chose que les juges ont une obligation vraiment de commencer à savoir, d'interacter avec les normes et les lois, les ordres juridiques des Autochtones. Et ça arrive à certaines places. Dans un de mes articles que j'avais décrit, je parle à Nunavut. Puis Nunavut, même leurs juges territoriaux sont en train de commencer à vraiment travailler avec les concepts inuits. Ça s'appelle IQ pour bref, Inuit Quahajamjijit. Mais ça veut, tu vois, de plus en plus, ces concepts inuits, c'est comme des grands concepts meta-principles qui sont écrits dans les lois. Mais en plus de ça, il y a des décisions dans le domaine criminel, le domaine de droit de la famille, où est-ce que le juge des tribunaux étatiques sont en train de commencer à utiliser ces concepts. C'est intéressant, il y a aussi des risques, mais c'est vraiment intéressant de voir qu'il y a des juges qui commencent à faire ça. Alors, oui, il faut que ça arrive parce que c'est le troisième ordre de juridique au Canada. Il ne faut pas se mettre la tête dans le sable parce que c'est ça. C'est ici, puis je pense que la question de la juridiction, puis l'autogouvernance, puis les droits autochtones, ça va juste agrandir. Alors, il faut que les juges commencent à vraiment prendre reconnaissance de cela.
Merci. Donc j'ai une question, c'est pour une précision de la part d'Andrew. Pourquoi on réfère à la langue illinois? Donc j'imagine qu'il y a une histoire derrière la terminologie que vous utilisez. Donc c'est sûrement un nom qui, selon l'auteur, est une adaptation française d'un nom algonquien.
Oui, c'est exact. Illinois, c'est pardon, ça vient de Obiswa, puis c'est Irenois, meaning quelqu'un qui parle correctement français. Ça, c'est exact. C'est le nom, c'est donc un exonyme qui a été donné par les Français ou la Confédération des peuples qui parlaient la langue nous, on appelle maintenant, les linguistes appellent plutôt en fait Miami Illinois, parce que c'était parlé, c'est des dialectes différents, mais c'était parlé par les Illinois et les Miamiens. Le mot pour que les Illinois avaient pour eux-mêmes, c'est Inoka. Puis ça, c'est le mot qu'on trouve dans les dictionnaires jésuites ou aussi dans le dictionnaire moderne. Les Illinois, dans le sens qu'une confédération, c'est une terminologie historique. Maintenant, on parle des Peoria, qui était une des tribus, enfin des groupes qui a absorbé des autres groupes qui étaient dans la confédération, puis des Miamiens. Donc, la langue moderne pourrait être appelée Pioloalia Miamia, rather than Miami, Illinois, mais par convention, la langue est, comment dire, on réfère à la langue Miami Illinois. Juste, je pense que ça clarifie. Puis, oui, c'est parlé juste aux États-Unis. Mais c'est parce que mes études historiques penchent sur l'Empire français en Louisiane, puis surtout le pays des Illinois, comme on utilise ici, qui était partie de la plus grande pays dans le haut, qui englobait toutes les grandes lacs.
Merci. J'ai une réflexion, une question de la part de Linda Brisebois qui dit que vos réflexions sont très pertinentes. Ça nous fait davantage apprécier ces aspects de nos langues aussi. Je suis tout à fait d'accord. On voit des choses qui étaient pas évidentes avant en faisant la comparaison. Et puis la question, c'est pour les sources précises à nous recommander pour nous aider à nous familiariser davantage. Est-ce que, à part le texte qui va apparaître de Naomi bientôt, est-ce que vous avez des ressources à recommander?
Il n'y a pas tant sur le lien. Ben, il commence à voir, Matthew Fletcher a un article, il est un juge des tribunaux à les États-Unis, des tribal court. Puis il écrit un petit peu sur cela, mais il y a vraiment des bons articles maintenant sur plein d'articles qui sont écrits sur la revitalisation des lois autochtones. Même je vais regarder vite, je pense que j'ai un document que j'ai donné à des juges quand j'avais fait du judicial training. Puis ça donne comme de basic pour de faire des bonnes lectures. Puis peut-être Kristen peut aussi, puis d'autres peuvent recommander d'autres. Mais il y a vraiment, je pense que si tu veux commencer, puis c'est nouveau à tout cela, peut-être le premier pour commencer avec, puis c'est maintenant, c'était traduit en français, c'est le livre du papa de Lindsay sur Canada's Indigenous Constitution. Je dirais que c'est le premier livre à commencer avec.
Et c'est traduit en français aussi récemment, cette année passée. Je peux aussi chercher. Je sais qu'il y a certains textes. Jane Macmillan a écrit sur le Ntouglimuk. Si vous cherchez des ressources précisément en droit Mi'kmaq. Et puis, oui, ça commence à être plus facile à trouver des ressources juste sur la question de revitalisation en général. Mais John Burroughs, c'est un des pathbreakers, des gens au centre de ce mouvement. Donc, pour l'instant, je ne vois pas d'autres questions. Peut-être il y avait juste un suivi sur l'incorporation au contexte criminel, parce que Naomi a parlé juste un peu généralement de l'ouverture envers les traditions autochtones, mais bien sûr, il y a des exemples plus précis si vous voulez creuser un petit peu les exemples des sentencing circles et d'autres méthodologies qu'on fait pour effectivement éviter le prison.
C'est ça. Je veux dire, ce que je dirais pour cette question, c'est que d'une manière, la manière que les sentencing circles soient utilisés à ce point-ci, c'est plutôt un peu comme GLADU, c'est comme pallier le système étatique criminel qui a des effets assez sérieux sur les peuples autochtones. Puis c'est important, je ne veux pas dire que c'est pas important, mais la conversation sur les droits des peuples autochtones, c'est d'utiliser les lois des peuples autochtones pour gérer ces questions. Alors, il y a une différence. C'est assez la manière que je vois ça, c'est des fois de pallier le système existant étatique, puis l'autre, c'est d'utiliser les concepts des groupes autochtones pour trancher des questions juridiques. Mais les sentencing circles, je pense d'une manière, on pourrait les analyser pour voir qu'il y a en effet des valeurs, des principes des groupes autochtones qui viennent, mais des fois, c'est plutôt basé sur une question plus générale. Comment devrait-on réagir à ce que cet individu a fait au point de vue criminel? Mais ça me fait penser dans un de mes articles que j'avais écrit de différentes manières que les lois autochtones commencent à venir devant les tribunaux. Puis, il y a des risques. Des fois, si on voit des juges qui commencent à trancher des questions utilisant des lois, des traditions juridiques qui ne viennent pas d'eux, comme il y avait une cause à Nunavut où est-ce qu'il y a un juge, mais ils disent qu'il sait beaucoup des traditions inuites. Mais sa décision a été renversée par la Cour d'appel qui ont dit, mais tu as pris ta propre interprétation de qu'est-ce que c'était cette loi inuit, puis tu aurais dû plutôt parler ou avoir une manière d'avoir plus de preuves sur qu'est-ce que la communauté pensait de cette principe. Mais je pense qu'il y a beaucoup d'options. Un, c'est d'avoir des experts qui viennent devant la cour, mais je pense qu'il y a d'autres. On pourrait utiliser le concept même d'un sentencing circle peut-être un peu différent pour vraiment parler avec un groupe de la communauté, un groupe d'aînés, ceux qui ont des savoirs, des connaissances dans la loi du groupe, de vraiment, en effet, parler avec le juge, avec ceux qui essaient de leur ordre juridique, pas juste ce qui est de prévenir quelqu'un pour aller dans le système correctionnel, mais plutôt parler avec de la loi. En tout cas, c'est des questions qui me fascinent beaucoup. Merci.
Et je vois pas d'autres questions, mais par contre, je vois un commentaire que notre collègue Carrie Sloan a fait avant. Elle avait pas vu venir pour la session tantôt, mais je pense qu'elle est toujours avec nous, Carrie. Et est-ce que tu veux présenter ta commentaire parce que c'est super intéressant, la langue métisse en fait. Donc il y a des parallèles super intéressants entre le droit métis et la langue métisse. Carrie, est-ce que tu es là? Je vois.
Oui, je suis ici. Je peux comprendre presque tout en français, mais je ne parle pas.
Vas-y en anglais si tu veux.
Yeah, there's a couple different languages of Métis peoples. And when I say Métis, I'm speaking the Métis Nation of the Northwest. And one is Michif, which is a language complex, but we were talking earlier about how there are many Algonquin languages that are really based in verbs, so there's a high percentage of verbs. So, and the same thing is true of Michif, and most of those verbs are either from Cree or Soto. And then the nouns in there are mostly from French, but occasionally from English. And there's kind of the versions, it's on a continuum. So sometimes there's more, Michif is more Cree or it's more French. It just depends on the dialect. And then there's Bungi, which people say is a dead language, but I'm not sure that it is. And I know, for instance, the Métis elder Maria Campbell, she says in her community, which is St. Louis near Saskatoon, they have Scottish Gaelic words in their version of Michif. So I'm not sure if that's Bungi or Michif, or it's just, it's all part of the language complex. But yeah, in Bungi, they had Scottish Gaelic and Scots, which, I don't know, Matthew, if you want to comment on this, but there's a debate about whether that's a dialect of English or its own language. So it seems like in those languages that there's the borrowings are from European languages, the nouns are from European languages, the verbs and other parts of speech are from Indigenous languages. And so in my work on Métis law, I really see how there's a real foundationally Indigenous part of Métis law, but there's European borrowings. So I just see a parallel with how Michif developed and how Métis law developed. Even though it's bringing in many, many different ideas from different cultures, it's maybe the whole is, I shouldn't say greater, but the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, if you like. I mean, so it's its own thing, but it's kind of a weaving of various different elements. And I just want to say on the point of weaving that the Cree scholar, Sylvia McAdam, who's a Cree speaker, she says in the Cree Y dialect, the law, which is usually, the word that is usually translated as law into English, comes from a Cree word meaning weaving. So I like to use weaving as a metaphor, at least for Métis law. So thanks, Kirsten.
Merci Carrie, je suis contente qu'on a pu entendre de toi. Et donc je vois pas d'autres questions. Naomi, merci. Vous avez partagé une bibliographie des ressources sur le droit autochtone. Donc pour ceux qui s'intéressent, et vu que je vois pas d'autres questions, d'autres interventions, je vais conclure cette session. Peut-être Marc, je passe la parole à Marc pour dire les derniers mots.
Je vais faire écho à Kirsten, remercier tout le monde, les intervenants surtout, mais vous tous et toutes qui sont venus, puis qui, la plupart d'entre vous, sont restés les 3 heures et demie. Donc, c'est très apprécié. Et j'espère que cet événement donnera lieu à d'autres événements différents, semblables, plus petits, qui nous permettront de se rencontrer en personne à un moment donné. Alors, un très, très grand merci, Miigwech, et je vous souhaite tous un bel après-midi, tous et toutes. Merci.
If I may, just on Scots, since it's no longer really spoken by anybody. There's a lot of Scots words, which are dialectical words, which if you're growing up in Scotland or in Northern Ireland, just part of life. Historically, I think you would consider it a dialect in the same way that Middle English, where if you read Chaucer, is a dialect. It is politicized, of course, as are Indigenous languages, because in Northern Ireland, you find Scots, because part of my family is from Belfast, you find Scots signage. And this is a reaction to the Unionists, to the use of Gaelic signage in Northern Ireland. So it's quite a delicate question about whether you consider it a language or not, because it's tied in with the Troubles there. And of course, politics is always there. language.
Oh, thanks, Matthew.
Merci. Au revoir tout le monde.